Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating moments in Westerosi history, a gathering that seemed, at the time, to be nothing more than a grand celebration of chivalry and martial prowess. We'll journey back to the year of the False Spring to 281 years after Aegon's conquest, when the greatest lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms assembled at Harrenhal for a tournament that would change everything. We'll discover how a crown of blue winter roses could spark a war, how a moment of beauty contained the seeds of catastrophe, and how those present could not possibly have known they were witnessing the last peaceful gathering before the realm tore itself apart. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a tale of battle and bloodshed, though consequences there certainly were. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the social landscape of that extraordinary gathering, the motivations of those who attended, the mysteries that emerged, and the human stories behind the legendary events. We'll examine the tournament not as the beginning of a war, but as a moment when the world balanced on a knife's edge, when different choices might have led to different futures, by the end. I think you'll find that history's great turning points are rarely recognised as such by those living through them. If you enjoy these calm explorations of Westeros and its rich history, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community. Your presence makes these journeys more meaningful. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and let it move through you. Let's begin our slow drift through the story of Harrenhal's fateful tournament. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, just listen and let the story of that false spring, of those blue winter roses, and of a realm standing unknowingly at the edge of transformation unfold before you. The world can wait. For now, there are only voices from the past and the quiet space you've made for yourself tonight. Before we can understand what happened at Harrenhal in that year of the False Spring, we need to understand the world in which it happened. And that world, in 281 years after the conquest, was one balanced precariously between order and chaos, between the dignity of centuries of Targaryen rule and the slow unravelling of a king's mind. It was a world that seemed stable on its surface, where the great houses maintained their ancient holdings and the realm had known relative peace for a generation. But beneath that surface, tensions were building, madness was growing, and the very foundations of the kingdom were beginning to crack. The Iron Throne was occupied by Aerys Targaryen, the second of his name, a man who had once been called promising, even brilliant in his youth. The maesters who chronicled his early reign spoke of a king interested in ambitious projects, in grand schemes to improve the realm. He had been friends with Tywin Lannister since childhood, and when Aerys took the throne, he had made Tywin his hand, creating one of the most effective partnerships between king and hand that Westeros had seen in generations. For a time, it seemed the realm was in capable hands, but something had gone wrong. The exact nature of Aerys's descent into what history would call madness is difficult to trace with precision. Was it the trauma of being held captive at Duskendale, when Lord Darklyn had imprisoned him for half a year? Was it something inherent in his nature, perhaps related to the Targaryen practice of marrying brother to sister, which sometimes, as the saying went, produced greatness and sometimes produced madness? Was it simply the corruption that comes with absolute power held too long? We cannot know for certain, and perhaps it was all of these things working together, each feeding the others. What we do know is that by 281, Aerys had become a figure of fear rather than respect. His suspicions had grown to encompass nearly everyone around him. He saw plots and treasons everywhere, in every whispered conversation, in every sidelong glance. His treatment of those he suspected was increasingly cruel, increasingly bizarre. He had become fascinated with wildfire, with the alchemists who produced it, with the green flames that consumed everything they touched. He spoke of burning his enemies, of cleansing the realm with fire. The king's physical appearance had deteriorated along with his mind. He refused to allow blades near him, even the barber's razor, and so his hair and beard had grown long and tangled. His fingernails had grown into yellow talons because he would not permit them to be cut. He was gaunt, wild-eyed, a frightening presence on the iron throne that his ancestor Aegon had forged from the swords of defeated enemies. The very throne seemed to reject him, for he cut himself upon it frequently, leading to the whispered saying that the throne knew who was unfit to sit upon it. Tywin Lannister, the capable hand who had governed so effectively, had resigned his position several years before the tournament. The exact reasons for his resignation were complex and much debated. Some said it was because Aerys had taken liberties with Tywin's wife Joanna, making cruel jests about whether Tywin's twin children were truly his own. Others pointed to Aerys's appointment of Tywin's eldest son Jaime to the Kingsguard, a great honour on its surface, but one that removed Tywin's heir from the succession of Casterly Rock. Still others suggested that Tywin simply could no longer stomach serving a king who had become a monster. Whatever the reason, Tywin's departure had left a void. The kings who followed Aerys were less capable or were cowed by the king's increasing paranoia. The realm was being governed after a fashion, but the steady hand that had guided it was gone. Lords throughout the Seven Kingdoms watched nervously, wondering what the mad king might do next, wondering how much longer this could continue. But if Aerys represented the darkness growing in the realm, his son Rhaegar represented its hope, or so many believed. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, eldest son of Aerys and heir to the Iron Throne, was in nearly every way his father's opposite. Where Aerys was wild and unpredictable, Rhaegar was measured and thoughtful. Where Aerys saw enemies everywhere, Rhaegar seemed to see the good in people, to believe in the old songs of chivalry and honour. He was considered by many to be the finest prince the realm had seen in generations. Rhaegar was beautiful in the distinctive Targaryen way, with the silver-gold hair and purple eyes of old Valyria. But it was more than his appearance that drew people to him. He was an accomplished musician, often playing the harp and singing songs that could move listeners to tears. He was well-read, conversing easily with maesters about history and prophecy. He was skilled at arms. Having trained with some of the finest knights in the realm, he seemed to embody everything a crown prince should be. And yet there was something melancholy about Rhaegar, something that even those who admired him most could not help but notice. He smiled rarely, and his smiles never quite reached his eyes. He seemed burdened by thoughts he shared with no one, weighed down by concerns that went beyond the ordinary worries of a crown prince. Those who knew him said he was obsessed with prophecy, with ancient texts about heroes and world-ending threats, with the idea that he had some great destiny to fulfill. What exactly he believed, what exactly drove his melancholy, remained a mystery to those around him. Rhaegar was married to Elia Martell of Dorne, a union that had been arranged to bring the realm's southernmost kingdom more firmly into the Targaryen fold. Elia was a princess of Dorne, sister to Prince Doran Martell, a woman described as gentle and good-hearted. She had given Rhaegar 2 children, a daughter named Rhaenys and a son named Aegon, fulfilling her duty to provide heirs to the throne. But the births had been difficult for her, particularly that of Aegon, and the maesters said she was unlikely to survive another pregnancy. She was often unwell, her health fragile, though her spirit remained strong. The marriage between Rhaegar and Elia was, by all accounts, respectful and proper, though perhaps not passionate. They fulfilled their duties to each other and to the realm. Whether there was love between them, true affection beyond the requirements of dynastic marriage, is something we cannot know from this distance. What we do know is that Elia was devoted to her children, and that Rhaegar treated her with courtesy and care, which in royal marriages was often as much as could be hoped for. Beyond the royal family, the great houses of Westeros maintained their ancient positions and rivalries. In the north, Lord Rickard Stark ruled from Winterfell as Warden of the North, continuing a line of Stark lords that stretched back 8,000 years to the Age of Heroes. Rickard was a serious man, concerned with the harsh realities of northern life, with preparing for winters that could last years, with maintaining the traditions of the first men and the old gods. He had several children, and in the manner of great lords seeking to strengthen their house's position, he had been arranging advantageous marriages for them. His eldest son Brandon, called the Wild Wolf for his fierce nature and hot temper, was betrothed to Catelyn Tully, daughter of Lord Hoster Tully of Riverrun. This would bind the north to the Riverlands, creating an alliance between two of the realm's great regions. His second son, Eddard, called Ned by those who knew him, was fostering at the Eyrie under Lord Jon Arryn, learning the ways of lordship far from the frozen north. This was both an education and a way of building bonds between houses, as fostered children often formed lifelong friendships with their fosterers and fellow wards. Rickard's daughter Lyanna was perhaps the most spirited of his children, a girl who embodied the northern wildness in ways that both delighted and worried her father. She was skilled with horses, preferring to ride rather than sit at needlework. She had a strong sense of justice and was unafraid to speak her mind, even when it might have been wiser to stay silent. She was beautiful, with a long, stark face and dark hair, and she had been betrothed to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, a match that would bind the north to the Stormlands just as Brandon's betrothal bound it to the Riverlands. Robert Baratheon was in many ways Brandon Stark's counterpart in the south, a young lord known for his prowess in battle, his immense physical strength and his love of wine, women and song. Robert was fostering at the Eyrie alongside Ned Stark, and the two had become as close as brothers, perhaps closer than brothers given the bonds that form between young men far from home, facing challenges together. Robert was boisterous and charming, quick to laugh and quick to anger, a man of large appetites and larger ambitions. Robert had fallen deeply in love with his betrothed Lyanna Stark, also he believed. Whether Lyanna returned his feelings was less clear. She had agreed to the betrothal, as dutiful daughters did, but those who knew her said she had reservations about Robert's nature, about his wandering eye and his inability to be faithful even before marriage. Still, the match made political sense, and in the world of Westerosi nobility, political sense often mattered more than personal feelings. At the Eyrie, Lord Jon Arryn presided over the Vale of Arryn as he had for many years. Jon Arryn was old enough to be father or even grandfather to his young wards, and he took his responsibility for shaping them seriously. He was known as an honourable man, one who valued duty and justice, and he was working to instil these same values in Robert and Ned. The bonds being formed at the Eyrie between Arryn, Baratheon and Stark would prove significant in the years to come, though none of them knew it at the time. In the Riverlands, Lord Hoster Tully of Riverrun was arranging the marriages of his daughters with the same careful attention to political advantage that Rickard Stark employed. His daughter Catelyn was promised to Brandon Stark, and his younger daughter Lisa was being considered for other matches that might strengthen House Tully's position. The Riverlands, situated at the heart of Westeros with borders touching many other regions, had always depended on alliances for their security, and Hoster was a master of the marriage alliance. In the west, Tywin Lannister brooded at Casterly Rock, removed from the governance of the realm but still immensely powerful. The Lannisters were the wealthiest house in Westeros, their gold mines seemingly inexhaustible, and Tywin had used that wealth to make his house feared and respected throughout the Seven Kingdoms. He had twin children, Cersei and Jaime, who were coming of age and who represented the future of his house. Cersei was beautiful and ambitious, dreaming of becoming queen, convinced since childhood that she was destined for greatness. Jaime was perhaps the finest young swordsman in the realm, golden-haired and charismatic, admired by nearly everyone who met him. Tywin had hoped to marry Cersei to Prince Rhaegar, a match that would have elevated House Lannister to the very pinnacle of power. But Aerys had refused, choosing Elia Martell instead, and Tywin had never forgiven the slight. His son Jaime's appointment to the Kingsguard, while nominally a great honour, had enraged Tywin because it removed his heir from the succession. Jaime would take vows of celibacy and hold no lands, meaning Tywin's line would pass through Cersei's children or through Tyrion, his malformed younger son whom Tywin despised. The tensions between Tywin Lannister and the Iron Throne were thus personal as well as political. In Dorne, the southernmost kingdom that had joined the Seven Kingdoms through marriage rather than conquest, House Martell maintained its distinctive culture and customs. Prince Doran Martell ruled from Sunspear, with his sister Elia married to the Crown Prince and his younger brother Oberyn gaining a reputation as the Red Viper, a dangerous and passionate man skilled with both weapons and poisons. Dorne had always been different from the rest of Westeros, with its equal inheritance laws, its more relaxed attitudes toward sexuality, its memory of having successfully resisted Targaryen conquest. The Dornish were proud, and they watched carefully to ensure that Elia was treated with the respect due, a princess of Dorne and future queen of the Seven Kingdoms. This, then, was the landscape of power in 281 after the conquest. A realm held together by tradition and the memory of Targaryen might. Ruled by a mad king and waiting for his more promising son to succeed him. A collection of great houses bound by marriage alliances and old rivalries, each pursuing their own interests while maintaining at least the appearance of loyalty to the Iron Throne. A world that seemed stable enough on its surface, where the forms of feudal society were carefully observed, where tournaments and feasts and formal courtesies masked the tensions beneath. And into this world came an unseasonable spring, a warmth that arrived too early and felt almost magical in its intensity. They called it the false spring because it came in the depth of what should have been winter, bringing flowers blooming and warmth spreading across the land. It was beautiful and unnatural, a gift that everyone knew could not last, but which they enjoyed while it did. The false spring became a metaphor for that entire year, for the brief moment of hope and beauty before the long cold that would follow. In this false spring, in this world balanced between hope and fear, between the promise of Rhaegar and the madness of Aerys, between old alliances and new tensions, Lord Walter Went of Harrenhal announced that he would hold a tournament, the greatest tournament the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. And with that announcement, with the decision of lords and ladies throughout the realm to attend, the stage was set for the gathering that would change everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what made this tournament so extraordinary, what drew so many to Harrenhal, and what purposes beyond mere celebration might have lain beneath its pageantry. But that contemplation can wait for now, can unfold slowly as we continue our journey through this pivotal moment in Westerosi history. The announcement, when it came, was extraordinary in its ambition. Lord Walter Went, who held Harrenhal in the name of his house, declared that he would host a grand tournament to celebrate his maiden daughter's name day. But this would be no ordinary tournament of the kind that occurred regularly throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The prizes alone were staggering, enough to make even the wealthiest lords take notice. 40,000 golden dragons would be distributed among the winners of various competitions, a sum so vast that it raised immediate questions about how House Went, respectable but hardly among the wealthiest in the realm, could possibly afford such extravagance. For the champion of the joust there would be 10,000 golden dragons. For the victor of the melee, 4,000. For the best archer, 2,000. For the finest singer, similar rewards awaited. These were prizes that could change a knight's fortune entirely, that could establish a minor lordling as a man of means, that could fund the building of a castle or the equipping of a small army. And beyond the gold there would be glory, the chance to prove oneself before the greatest gathering of nobility the realm had seen in a generation. The announcement rippled across Westeros throughout the latter months of 280, reaching every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Ravens flew from castle to castle carrying word of the tournament. Travelling merchants and minstrels spread the news through villages and towns. In keeps great and small, in training yards and great halls, men began to prepare. Knights who had not lifted a lance in years decided to compete. Young squires dreamed of somehow entering and winning glory. Lords saw opportunities for alliances, for marriages to be arranged, for political manoeuvring on a grand scale. But even as excitement built, questions arose. How could House Went possibly afford such a tournament? Lord Walter was not a poor man, certainly, but 40,000 golden dragons exceeded the annual incomes of all but the wealthiest houses. Some whispered that he must have discovered a cache of treasure hidden somewhere in Harrenhal's vast ruins. Perhaps gold left behind by Harren the Black before Aegon's dragons had turned his mighty fortress into a monument of melted stone and broken dreams. Others suggested that Lord Walter had secured loans from wealthier houses, perhaps from the Freys or even from Tywin Lannister, though what he might have offered as collateral for such sums remained unclear. The more cynical observers, particularly those who paid close attention to the subtle currents of politics, suspected that Lord Walter was not actually the tournament's true sponsor. They noted that Prince Rhaegar had become friendly with several lords in the Riverlands, and that the prince had been known to travel in that region. They observed that Rhaegar had been reading extensively about the great councils of the past. Those gatherings where the lords of the realm had come together to decide matters of succession or to address crises that threatened the kingdom. Could it be that Rhaegar himself was secretly financing the tournament, using Lord Went as a front to avoid his father's suspicion? This theory gained traction among those who understood just how dire the situation with King Aerys had become. If Rhaegar was indeed behind the tournament, then perhaps he intended to use the gathering for a purpose beyond mere celebration. Perhaps he meant to call an informal Great Council to quietly sound out the great lords about what might be done regarding his father's increasing madness. Such a move would be dangerous, technically treasonous even, but it might also be necessary if the realm was to be saved from Aerys's worst impulses. The idea that Rhaegar might address his father's unfitness to rule was both hopeful and troubling to those who contemplated it. On one hand, it suggested that the prince understood the severity of the problem and was willing to act. On the other hand, it meant navigating extraordinarily dangerous political waters. Aerys might be mad, but he was still king, still commanded the loyalty of the Kingsguard, still sat upon the Iron Throne with all the authority that position commanded. Moving against him, even with the best intentions, even with the support of the realm's great lords, would be fraught with peril. Others suggested different ulterior motives. Perhaps the tournament was meant to demonstrate Rhaegar's popularity, to show that when he called, the realm answered. Perhaps it was intended to build alliances in preparation for his eventual succession, to identify which lords would support him and which might prove difficult. Perhaps it was simply what it claimed to be, a grand celebration, but one that would serve the secondary purpose of gathering intelligence about the state of the realm, about which houses were strong and which were weak, as about where tensions lay and where opportunities might be found. Whatever the truth of its sponsorship and purpose, the tournament was announced, and Westeros responded with enthusiasm. In castles throughout the Seven Kingdoms, preparations began. This would be more than just a martial competition. It would be a social event of unprecedented scale, a chance for the nobility to see and be seen, to arrange marriages and alliances, to settle old disputes and forge new friendships. For many, particularly those who lived in remote regions far from the centres of power, it would be a rare opportunity to observe the great lords and ladies of the realm, to glimpse the royal family, to participate however peripherally in the grand theatre of Westerosi politics. The location itself was significant. Harrenhal stood on the north shore of the God's Eye, the vast lake in the southeastern Riverlands. It was, without question, the largest castle in all of Westeros, though also the most ruinous. The castle had been built by Harren the Black, the last of the Ironborn kings who had conquered and held the Riverlands through force and terror. Harren had spent 40 years building his great fortress, using forced labour from the river lords, bleeding the Riverlands dry to create a monument to his own power and ambition. The castle that resulted from those 4 decades of labour was truly massive. Its curtain walls were so thick that 24 horses could ride abreast along their battlements. It had 5 enormous towers, the tallest of which, the Tower of Dread, stood almost as high as the wall in the far north. Within its walls, it was said, all the other castles of Westeros could fit. It had vast stables, enormous granaries, a godswood of several acres, and a great hall large enough to feast thousands. It was meant to be impregnable, the ultimate fortress, a castle that could never be taken no matter how large the besieging army. The preparations for hosting such an event were immense. Lord Went and his household spent months getting ready. The portions of the castle that would be used had to be cleaned and repaired. Provisions had to be gathered, enough food and drink to feed thousands for days or even weeks. Temporary structures had to be built, pavilions and tents for the hundreds who would not fit within the castle walls. Lists had to be constructed for the jousting, and a field prepared for the melee. Seating had to be arranged for those who would watch the competitions, with the places of honour reserved for the highest nobility. Word spread not just to the nobility but to common folk as well. A tournament of this scale would draw merchants hoping to sell their wares, minstrels and entertainers seeking to perform for crowds, prostitutes looking for customers, pickpockets and con artists hoping to exploit the chaos, and thousands of ordinary people who simply wanted to witness something extraordinary. A temporary city would spring up around Harrenhal, a chaotic and colourful gathering of humanity drawn by the promise of spectacle and opportunity. Throughout the realm, those planning to attend began their preparations. For the knights who would compete, this meant training, ensuring their armour was in perfect condition, selecting their best horses, practicing with lance and sword until every movement was instinctive. Some hired additional squires or grooms to assist them. Others sought out hedge knights or master-at-arms to help them prepare for the specific challenges of tournament combat, which, while similar to war, had its own particular demands and techniques. For the lords and ladies, preparation meant different things. Wardrobes had to be assembled, for a gathering of this importance demanded that one dress appropriately, that one's house be represented with proper dignity and style. Gifts had to be selected for those one hoped to honour or impress. Servants had to be chosen to accompany their lords, enough to maintain proper dignity, but not so many that travel became impossible. Letters had to be written arranging meetings with other lords, laying groundwork for negotiations that might take place during the tournament's social events. The great houses began planning their journeys. From the north, the Starks would travel south down the King's Road, a journey of many weeks even in the favourable weather of the fall spring. From Storm's End, Robert Baratheon would ride north through the Stormlands and into the Riverlands. From the Vale, Jon Arryn and his household would make their way down from the Mountains of the Moon. From Dorne, the Martells faced the longest journey, having to cross nearly the entire length of Westeros to reach Harrenhal. For many younger members of noble houses, this would be their first great gathering, their first chance to see how the realm's elite interacted, to learn the subtle arts of courtly behaviour, to begin forming the relationships that would shape their adult lives. Parents saw it as an educational opportunity as well as a social one. Their children would see the prince, would observe the Kingsguard, would witness the finest knights in the realm competing against each other. Such experiences were part of the education of nobility, teaching lessons that no Maester could impart through books alone. There was an air of excitement building throughout the realm as the date of the tournament approached. In alehouses and castles alike, people speculated about who would win the joust, whether Prince Rhaegar himself would compete, which young knights might make names for themselves. Songs were already being composed about the tournament before it had even begun, in anticipation of the legends that would surely emerge from such a gathering. What none of those travelling to Harrenhal could know, what perhaps could not have been known by anyone, was that they were journeying to a moment that would become a turning point in history. They thought they were going to a tournament, to a celebration, to a social and martial competition, and in one sense they were right. But they were also, unknowingly, going to witness the moment when the realm's fate would turn, when decisions would be made and gestures enacted that would lead to war and devastation, to the fall of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries, to the deaths of thousands and the transformation of Westeros. But that knowledge lay in the future. hidden from those who packed their bags and saddled their horses and set out for Harrenhal in the warmth of the false spring. For them, it was simply an exciting journey to what promised to be the greatest tournament anyone had ever seen. And in that anticipation, in that excitement and hope and curiosity, they rode toward a destiny none of them could have imagined. The first arrivals at Harrenhal came in the days leading up to the tournament's official beginning, and with each passing day, the gathering grew larger and more spectacular. What had been a relatively quiet castle, albeit one of enormous size, transformed into something resembling a great city, a temporary metropolis of silk pavilions and painted shields, of horses and people, and the constant hum of excitement that comes when thousands gather for a shared purpose. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen arrived with a company that befitted his status as heir to the Iron Throne, though those who observed his arrival noted something different about him, something that had changed or intensified in the months leading up to the tournament. He came with members of the King's Guard, those elite knights sworn to protect the royal family, and with household knights and servants appropriate to a prince. His pavilion, when erected, was magnificent, black silk decorated with the red three-headed dragon of his house, large enough to accommodate not just his own needs, but those of his wife and their retinue. Elia Martell of Dawn arrived with her husband, and those who saw her remarked on how frail she appeared, how the journey from King's Landing seemed to have taxed her strength. She had given birth to her son Aegon not quite a year before, and the childbirth had been difficult, leaving her weakened in a way she had not fully recovered from. The maesters had warned that another pregnancy might kill her, and this knowledge hung over the royal marriage, a shadow that complicated what should have been the straightforward matter of securing the succession with additional heirs. But despite her physical frailty, Elia was gracious and kind to all who approached her, embodying the gentleness for which she was known. She settled into the accommodations that had been prepared for her, and in the days before the tournament proper began, she could be seen taking the air in Harrenhal's Godswood, walking slowly among the ancient trees, sometimes accompanied by her Dornish ladies-in-waiting, sometimes by her husband, sometimes alone with her thoughts. Jaime arrived at Harrenhal not with his father's retinue, for Tywin had chosen not to attend but with the royal party, as his vows required. He was beautiful in the way young men sometimes are, golden-haired and green-eyed, tall and well-formed, moving with the natural grace of someone born to physical excellence. He had trained from childhood to be a warrior, and his skills had developed so rapidly that he was already counted among the finest swordsmen in the realm despite his youth. But Jaime's appointment to the King's Guard had not been his own choice, or rather, it had been a choice made in ignorance of its full implications. King Aerys had offered him the white cloak, and Jaime, young and eager for the honour, had accepted without consulting his father. Only later did he learn that Aerys had done this precisely to spite Tywin, to remove the Lannister heir from the succession, to ensure that Tywin's line would pass through his malformed youngest son Tyrion, rather than through his golden eldest. Tywin had resigned as Hand of the King immediately upon hearing of Jaime's appointment, returning to Casterly Rock in fury, and so Jaime arrived at Harrenhal caught between the honour of his position and the knowledge that accepting that honour had driven a wedge between himself and his father, between his family and the crown he was now sworn to serve. He wore the white cloak and armour of the King's Guard, but those who looked closely could see the conflict in his eyes, the beginning of the disillusionment that would shape his life in the years to come. From the north came the Starks, Lord Rickard and his children, travelling the long leagues down the King's Road with a retinue appropriate to the Warden of the North. Brandon Stark, the eldest son and heir to Winterfell, arrived in high spirits, eager for the competition, confident in his abilities. Brandon was everything a young northern lord should be, tall and strong and skilled with weapons. But he also had a wildness to him, a quick temper, and a tendency to act before thinking that had earned him the name the Wild Wolf. Brandon's brother Eddard, called Ned, came with his foster father Lord Jon Arryn from the Vale. The bond between Ned and Lord Arryn was clear to anyone who observed them, a relationship of mutual respect and affection that had developed over years of Ned's fostering at the Eyrie. Ned was quieter than his brother Brandon, more thoughtful and reserved, but those who trained with him knew he was no less skilled with a sword. He simply approached matters differently, with more caution and consideration. With the Starks came their sister Lyanna, and her arrival at Harrenhal did not go unnoticed. She was 16 years old, dark-haired and grey-eyed in the manner of House Stark, with what those who saw her described as a wild northern beauty. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that southern ladies cultivated, with their elaborate hairstyles and refined manners. Instead, there was something untamed about her. Something that suggested she would rather be riding a horse across the moors than sitting in a pavilion making polite conversation. Lyanna was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, though Robert had not yet arrived from Storm's End. The betrothal had been arranged by their fathers, a sensible match that would bind the North and the Stormlands together. Robert was said to be deeply in love with his betrothed, speaking of her often to his friend Ned Stark, composing verses in her honour, imagining the life they would share once they were married. Whether Lyanna shared Robert's enthusiasm for the match was less clear, at least to those who observed her carefully. The absence of certain figures was as notable as the presence of others. Tywin Lannister did not attend, remaining at Casterly Rock in what many interpreted as a deliberate snub to the crown. His absence was a statement, a way of showing his displeasure with King Aerys without openly defying him. However, other Lannisters were present, including various cousins and knights who served House Lannister, ensuring that the wealthiest house in Westeros was represented even if its lord chose to stay away. Cersei Lannister was not at Harrenhal either, having remained at Casterly Rock with her father. Some whispered that Tywin kept her close, still hoping to arrange a marriage that would salvage his dynastic ambitions after the disaster of Jaime's appointment to the Kingsguard. Cersei had hoped to marry Prince Rhaegar, had been convinced since childhood that she was destined to be queen, and the prince's marriage to Elia Martell had been a bitter disappointment to her. King Aerys himself did not attend the tournament, remaining in King's Landing. Some said this was because he feared to leave the safety of the Red Keep, that his paranoia had grown so severe that he suspected assassination attempts everywhere. Others suggested that he simply had no interest in tournaments, that his obsession with fire and his declining mental state had left him unable to appreciate such gatherings. Whatever the reason, his absence meant that Prince Rhaegar was the highest-ranking member of House Targaryen present, effectively representing the crown. The gathering at Harrenhal in those days before the tournament proper began had a peculiar quality, a sense of anticipation mixed with normalcy. During the daylight hours, the fields around the castle were busy with preparations. Squires practiced with their knights, helping them prepare for the competitions. Merchants called out their wares, selling everything from ribbons and trinkets to fine weapons and armour. Minstrels performed, competing with each other for the attention and coins of the gathering crowds. In the evenings there were feasts in Harrenhal's great hall, though the tournament had not yet officially begun. Lord Went hosted dinners for the greater lords and ladies, elaborate affairs with many courses, with wine flowing freely, with entertainment provided by the finest minstrels and performers who had gathered for the occasion. These dinners were opportunities for socialising, for renewing old friendships and forging new alliances, for the delicate dance of politics that was as much a part of noble life as any tournament competition. The conversations at these pre-tournament gatherings ranged across many subjects. Lords discussed the state of their lands, the harvests, the problems they faced with bandits or with difficult vassals. Ladies talked of marriages being arranged, of children growing up, of the fashions and customs of different regions. Knights spoke of battles they had fought, of training techniques, of the horses and armour they would use in the coming competitions. Through it all ran an undercurrent of political manoeuvring, subtle and not so subtle, as each house pursued its interests in the complex web of Westerosi power. There were preliminary competitions as well, smaller contests held in the days before the main events. There were horse races that drew enthusiastic crowds, with riders from across the realm competing to prove who had the fastest mount. There were archery competitions, with both professional soldiers and noble-born archers demonstrating their skill at hitting targets at various distances. There were contests of strength, men lifting heavy stones or wrestling each other for the entertainment of onlookers. Prince Rhaegar could sometimes be found in the Godswood, sitting beneath the weirwood tree with his harp, playing melodies that seemed to carry a melancholy that matched the prince's demeanour. Those who heard him play spoke of songs that could move them to tears, though they could not always say why. Rhaegar had a gift for music, a sensitivity that allowed him to convey emotions that words alone could not express. Some said he played for the gods, others that he played for himself, working through thoughts and feelings that weighed heavily upon him. The great lords and ladies of the realm were observing each other as well, noting who spoke with whom, who avoided whom, what alliances seemed to be forming or dissolving. This was as much a part of the tournament as the martial competitions, this careful observation and assessment of the political landscape. A conversation between two lords might seem casual, but it could represent the beginning of an alliance that would shape the realm's future. A deliberate snub, a refusal to acknowledge or greet someone, could signal a breach that might lead to conflict. And through it all, the tournament itself drew closer. The lists were being prepared. The long fences that would separate the jousting knights as they charged at each other with lances. The field for the melee was being marked out and prepared. The viewing stands were being constructed, with the places of honour reserved for the highest nobility in the royal family. Everything was being made ready for what would be the greatest tournament Westeros had seen in a generation, perhaps in a century. But beyond the preparations, beyond the excitement and anticipation, there was something else in the air at Harrenhal, something harder to define. It was a sense that something significant was going to happen, that this gathering was not just a tournament but a turning point. Some felt it as a premonition, a vague unease that they could not quite articulate. Others dismissed such feelings as mere nervousness before a great event. But looking back with the knowledge of what was to come, one might wonder if there was something in the air of that false spring, some hint of the transformation that was approaching, some whisper of the future carried on the unseasonably warm wind. The incident that would become known as the mystery of the Night of the Laughing Tree began simply enough, with the kind of casual cruelty that often occurs when young men of privilege encounter someone they perceive as beneath them. It happened in the days before the tournament proper commenced. During those preliminary events and informal gatherings, when the assembled masses were still finding their rhythm, still sorting themselves into the complex social hierarchies that governed medieval life. Howland Reed, the small lord from the Neck, had come to Harrenhal to witness the tournament, to see something of the wider world beyond the isolated marshes of his homeland. The Cranna men were not numerous at such gatherings, and Howland was alone among the thousands. A solitary figure whose small stature and different manner marked him as an outsider. He watched the preliminary competitions with interest, observing the knights and their squires, taking in the pageantry and spectacle of it all, with the wonder of someone seeing such things for the first time. On one of these days, Howland encountered 3 squires who had been drinking and were in the mood for amusement at someone else's expense. The squires served knights from houses that were respectable if not great, one a Frey from the twins, another from House Hay, and the third from House Blount. They were young men, not yet knights themselves, caught in that awkward position between childhood and full adulthood, eager to prove themselves but not yet having earned the status that would command respect. When they saw Howland Reed, small and alone and clearly different from the other Northmen present, they decided he would serve as entertainment. The exact nature of what they did to him varies in the telling, but all accounts agree that they mocked him, knocked him down, and generally treated him with the kind of casual violence that sometimes emerges when young men in groups encounter someone vulnerable. Perhaps they did not see it as particularly cruel, perhaps they thought it was merely jest, but to Howland, Alone and far from home and outnumbered, it was humiliating and frightening. But the story of Howland Reed's mistreatment did not end with the Starks' intervention. The next day, when the preliminary competitions resumed, a mystery knight appeared, someone who had not been present before, whose identity was concealed behind a helm, and whose shield bore a sigil that no one recognised. The shield displayed a weirwood tree with a face, the heart tree of the old gods, and the face was laughing. It was an unusual device not belonging to any known house, and its appearance immediately provoked curiosity and speculation among those gathered. The Knight of the Laughing Tree, as this mysterious figure came to be called, didn't enter the main tournament competitions, which had not yet begun. Instead, the knight challenged 3 specific individuals, the knights whose squires had attacked Howland Reed. The challenges were issued formally, in accordance with the customs of chivalry, and the 3 knights had little choice but to accept, for to refuse would be to appear cowardly before the assembled nobility of the realm. The resulting jousts were brief and decisive. The Knight of the Laughing Tree faced each of the 3 knights in turn and defeated all of them, unhorsing them with apparent ease. These were not weak or incompetent knights, they were trained warriors who had competed in tournaments before, and yet the Mystery Knight bested them all. After each victory, the Knight of the Laughing Tree did not claim the customary prize of the defeated knight's horse and armour. Instead, the knight demanded something else entirely. The demand was the same in all 3 cases. The defeated knights were required to teach their squires honour, to ensure that the young men who served them learned to behave with the dignity and respect that chivalry demanded. It was a public rebuke, delivered in front of thousands, making it clear that what had been done to Howland Reed was known and was being punished. The 3 knights, humiliated by their defeats and by the nature of the demand, had no choice but to agree. And then, before anyone could discover the Mystery Knight's identity, before the helm could be removed or questions answered, the Knight of the Laughing Tree disappeared. The distinctive shield was found abandoned, but the knight was gone, vanished into the crowds or perhaps into the castle, identity still concealed. The incident became the subject of intense speculation and gossip, with everyone at Harrenhal wondering who the Knight of the Laughing Tree had been and what had motivated the intervention on behalf of a minor Cranogman lord. The theories about the Mystery Knight's identity were numerous and varied. Some suggested it was a disguised hedge knight, someone without formal affiliation to any great house, who had been moved by a sense of justice to defend Howland Reed. Others proposed that it might have been one of the Stark brothers themselves, perhaps Brandon or Eddard, fighting in disguise to avenge the insult to someone who had been offered Stark protection. A few whispered that it might even have been a woman. Noting that the knight had not been particularly large, and that the jousting style, while effective, had not displayed the overwhelming power that characterized many male knights. What is certain is that King Aerys, when he learned of the Mystery Knight, reacted with characteristic paranoia. In his deteriorating mental state, the king saw conspiracies everywhere, and a Mystery Knight whose identity was concealed seemed to him to be obviously part of a plot against him. Perhaps, Aerys thought, this was an assassin who had come to Harrenhal specifically to kill him, disguised as a tournament knight to get close to the royal family. Or perhaps it was a symbol of rebellion, a challenge to royal authority, someone deliberately flouting the conventions that should make every knight's identity known and verifiable. Aerys's reaction was immediate and excessive. He commanded that the Mystery Knight be found, that every effort be made to discover who had dared to conceal their identity at a royal tournament. He sent his own son, Prince Rhaegar, to search for the Knight of the Laughing Tree, to hunt through the encampments and question those who might know something, to leave no stone unturned until the mystery was solved. The king's agitation was evident to all who observed him, his fear and anger creating an atmosphere of tension that contrasted sharply with the festive mood that had prevailed before. Prince Rhaegar conducted the search as his father commanded, but what he found, if anything, remains one of the great mysteries of that tournament. The official accounts say that Rhaegar searched thoroughly, but was unable to identify the Knight of the Laughing Tree, that the Mystery Knight had simply vanished without leaving sufficient traces to follow. But there are hints, suggestions in some accounts, that Rhaegar may have discovered more than he revealed to his father, that perhaps he learned the knight's identity but chose not to disclose it for reasons of his own. If Rhaegar did discover that the Knight of the Laughing Tree was Lyanna Stark, what would he have done with that knowledge? As a prince and a knight himself, he would have been bound by the codes of chivalry, which included protecting the honour of ladies. If Lyanna had indeed disguised herself to fight in the tournament, revealing her identity would expose her to scandal and potential punishment, would shame her before the assembled nobility. A true knight, discovering such a secret, might well choose to keep it, to protect the lady in question even at the cost of disappointing his king. And if this was indeed what happened, if Rhaegar discovered Lyanna's secret and chose to protect her, it would have created a bond between them, a shared secret that connected them in a way that mere formal acquaintance could not. This possible first real meeting between Rhaegar and Lyanna, if the theory is correct, would have been charged with significance, the beginning of something that neither of them fully understood at the time, but which would alter the course of their lives and the history of Westeros. The incident revealed Lyanna's character in ways that would prove significant. Whether or not she was the Knight of the Laughing Tree, her intervention on Howland Reed's behalf showed her to be someone who would not tolerate injustice, who would act when she saw wrong being done regardless of whether it was safe or proper for her to do so. She was not content to be a passive observer of events, to sit quietly and accept the world as it was. Instead, she sought to shape events, to correct wrongs, to impose her own sense of justice on situations that offended her. And yet, despite the king's agitation, despite the mystery and speculation, the incident of the Knight of the Laughing Tree passed without resolution. The Mystery Knight was not found, or if found, not revealed. King Aerys eventually subsided into his usual paranoid watchfulness. The tournament preparations continued, moving toward the main events that everyone had come to witness. The incident became a strange interlude, a memorable story, but not, it seemed at the time, something that would have lasting significance. But looking back, knowing what came after, one might see the incident differently. One might see it as the moment when Rhaegar and Lyanna first truly noticed each other, if the theory about Rhaegar discovering her secret is correct. One might see it as a demonstration of Lyanna's character, her willingness to act decisively and even recklessly in pursuit of what she believed was right. One might see it as another sign of the king's madness, another indication that the realm was building toward a crisis. One might see it as the first small pebble that, once disturbed, would start an avalanche. The weirwood tree in Harrenhal's Godswood, with its carved face, stood silent through all of this, as it had stood silent through 3 centuries of human drama since Aegon's conquest. If the old gods were watching, if they took notice of the Knight of the Laughing Tree and the young people whose lives were beginning to intertwine in ways that would prove momentous, they gave no sign. The Heart Tree simply was, as it had always been, witnessing without judging, recording in ways we cannot understand the events that unfolded beneath its branches. The incident resolved, or rather failed to resolve, and Harrenhal's great tournament moved forward toward its main competitions. The mystery of the Laughing Weirwood Knight would remain a mystery, discussed and debated but never definitively explained. And Howland Reed, the small lord from the Neck whose mistreatment had sparked the entire incident, would carry the memory of it for the rest of his life, along with whatever secrets he knew about that day, secrets he would guard carefully through all the years to come. With the mystery of the Laughing Knight unresolved but gradually fading from immediate concern, the tournament at Harrenhal moved into its main phase, the competitions that everyone had travelled so far to witness. The jousting, the centrepiece of any great tournament, would determine who among the assembled knights could claim to be the finest lancer in all of Westeros. The melee would test endurance, strength and tactical thinking in a chaotic simulation of actual battle. And through it all, the watching crowds would cheer and gasp and place their wagers, living vicariously through the armoured men who risked their bodies for glory and gold. The opening ceremonies were magnificent, carefully orchestrated to display the wealth and power of those involved, while honouring the traditions that made tournaments meaningful. Lord Walter Went presided over the proceedings, though everyone understood that this was as much a royal event as a private one, with Prince Rhaegar representing the Iron Throne in his father's absence. The knights who would compete were presented, riding in procession before the assembled nobility, their armour polished to brilliant shine, their horses groomed to perfection, their shields displaying the countless sigils of houses great and small from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. The heralds announced each knight as they passed, calling out their names and titles and lineages, a litany of Westerosi nobility that went on for what must have seemed like hours. There were knights from the north, fewer in number than from other regions because the north was vast but thinly populated, and the journey was long. There were many from the Riverlands, as Harrenhal was in their territory and they had not far to travel. The Vale sent its famous knights, men trained in the high traditions of chivalry that mountainous kingdom particularly valued. The Stormlands contributed fierce warriors, men whose lands had been shaped by constant conflict and harsh weather. The Reach sent perhaps the most knights of any region, as befitted the most populous and fertile kingdom. Men whose armour gleamed with elaborate decoration, and whose horses were the finest that gold could buy. From Dawn came knights who fought in styles slightly different from their northern counterparts, influenced by the Rhoynar traditions that had mixed with Andal and First Men bloodlines in that unique southern kingdom. From the Westerlands came Lannister knights, and those of houses sworn to Casterly Rock, their equipment testament to the gold that financed it. And from the royal court came members of the Kingsguard and other knights in the crown service, representing the throne itself in the competitions. The viewing stands had been arranged with careful attention to hierarchy and precedence. The highest platform was reserved for the prince and princess, for Rhaegar and Elia and any other royalty present. Lord Went and his family occupied positions of honour as well, as hosts of the tournament. The great lords and ladies sat according to their rank and importance, with complex determinations made about who deserved which seats, decisions that could spark resentment if handled poorly, but which passed without major incident thanks to careful planning. The common folk, the thousands who had travelled to Harrenhal or lived in the surrounding region, had their own areas from which to watch, standing or sitting on the ground at greater distances from the lists, but still able to see the action, still able to participate in the spectacle even if from the periphery. For many of them, this would be the greatest event they would witness in their entire lives, something they would tell their children and grandchildren about, the time they saw the great tournament at Harrenhal, where all the realm gathered in the full spring. The jousting began with the preliminary rounds, the early matches that would eliminate the less skilled or less fortunate knights, and narrow the field toward the champions who would compete in the final rounds. The format of tournament jousting was well established by centuries of tradition. Two knights would charge at each other along opposite sides of a fence called the tilt, each carrying a lance, each trying to strike the other's shield or body with sufficient force to knock him from his horse. Points were awarded based on where the lance struck and whether the opponent was unhorsed, with breaking one's lance against the opponent's shield being a lesser achievement than actually unhorsing him. The sound of a tournament joust was distinctive and unforgettable to those who heard it. The thunder of hooves as the armoured warhorses charged toward each other, building speed across the length of the lists, the crowd's roar rising as the knights approached the moment of impact. The tremendous crash when lance met shield, the splintering of wood if the lance broke, the clang of metal if it struck armour, the varied reactions of the crowd, cheering if their favoured knight succeeded, groaning if he failed, gasping if someone took a particularly hard fall. The dangers of jousting were real, despite the fact that this was sport rather than war. Knights were injured regularly, suffering broken bones, concussions, and worse. Horses could be injured or killed if a fall went badly. Deaths, while not common, were not unheard of either. A lance could slip past the shield and strike a vulnerable point, could pierce through armour if the angle was unfortunate, could catch a rider in just the wrong way and cause injuries that no maester could heal. Every knight who entered the lists knew these risks and accepted them as part of the price of glory. In the early rounds, there were upsets and surprises, as there always were in tournaments. Knights who had travelled far and arrived with great reputations found themselves unhorsed by relative unknowns. Younger men, perhaps more quick or more desperate to prove themselves, defeated veterans who had won tournaments before. The randomness of it, the way that a single lucky strike could defeat superior skill, was part of what made tournaments exciting to watch and frustrating to compete in. Prince Rhaegar entered the list as a competitor, which was somewhat unusual for an heir to the throne, but not unprecedented. Rhaegar was known to be skilled with weapons, having trained with some of the finest knights in the realm, but he was not considered the absolute best jouster among those present. He was graceful in his movements, precise in his technique, but he lacked the raw power that characterized some of the larger and stronger knights. Still, he was the prince, and when he rode, the crowds cheered more loudly than for anyone else, and his opponents faced the psychological challenge of jousting against the heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaegar's armour was distinctive, black plate decorated with the red three-headed dragon of House Targaryen worked in rubies that caught the light brilliantly. His horse was black as well, a magnificent destrier that had been trained specifically for tournament combat. When he rode in the lists, lance couched and shield ready, he looked every inch the prince from a song, the romantic figure of knightly virtue that he seemed to embody despite his melancholy temperament. In his early matches, Rhaegar performed well, defeating his opponents with the solid competence that one would expect from someone of his training and status. He was not dominant in the way that some knights were, not overwhelming in his power, but he was effective and consistent. He advanced through the early rounds without particular difficulty, though neither did he seem to be coasting, each match requiring genuine effort and skill. Sir Barristan Selmy, the legendary member of the Kingsguard, competed despite being older than most of the other knights in the tournament. Barristan was in his early 40s by this time, an age when most knights had retired from tournament competition, or at least had seen their skills diminish. But Barristan was Barristan the Bold, a knight whose prowess had been proven in actual combat as well as in tournaments, and he showed no sign of being intimidated by younger opponents. Barristan's style in the joust was economical and precise. He did not waste energy on flourishes or displays. Instead, he focused entirely on the task at hand, on timing his strikes perfectly, on maintaining his seat no matter how hard he was struck, on exploiting the small errors that all opponents made if one watched carefully enough. His years of experience showed in subtle ways, in how he positioned himself, in how he read his opponent's movements, in how he knew exactly when to lean and when to brace for impact. The crowds loved Barristan, loved watching a legend prove that his reputation was deserved, that age had not diminished the essential qualities that made him one of the finest knights the Seven Kingdoms had ever produced. When he won his matches, the applause was respectful and warm, the appreciation of people watching a master practice his craft. Even those who had wagered against him could not help but admire the skill with which he competed. Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, was perhaps the favourite among many to win the joust, though tournament outcomes were never certain, and favourites fell as often as they triumphed. Arthur was in his prime, a few years younger than Barristan. With all the advantages of youth combined with years of experience, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew his own abilities and had no need to prove anything to anyone except in the actual performance. Arthur's jousting was beautiful to watch, though beauty in this context meant efficiency and power combined with grace. His strikes were thunderous, his lance finding its target with seemingly inevitable accuracy. His seat in the saddle was perfect, balanced in a way that made it extraordinarily difficult to unseat him, even with a solid strike. He advanced through his early matches with an ease that suggested he was not being particularly challenged, though whether this was because his opponents were genuinely inferior or because Arthur simply made it look easy was difficult to determine. Young Jaime Lannister competed as well, newly appointed to the Kingsguard and eager to prove that his appointment had been based on merit rather than merely on his father's influence and the king's desire to spite Tywin. Jaime was not yet 17 years old, but he had been training since childhood, and his natural talent was evident to anyone who watched him fight. He was fast, faster than most of the older knights, with reflexes that seemed almost supernaturally quick. Jaime's jousting style was aggressive, even reckless at times, as befitted his youth and temperament. He charged with complete commitment, striking with all the power he could muster, showing no fear of being struck in return. This approach worked well for him in some matches, overwhelming opponents who were not prepared for such ferocity. In other matches, it made him vulnerable, as older and more experienced knights could exploit his aggression, could wait for him to overcommit and then counter. The crowds were divided in their response to Jaime. Some admired his skill and his courage, saw in him the promise of greatness. Others whispered about his appointment to the Kingsguard, about how his father had been furious, about the political implications of having the Lannister heir sworn to celibacy and service, rather than continuing his family line. And a few, though they would not say it openly, felt a certain satisfaction when Jaime lost, as if his defeats confirmed their suspicion that he had not truly earned his white cloak. Brandon Stark competed as well, the wild wolf showing that his reputation was not undeserved. Brandon was strong and aggressive, riding with the kind of fierce determination that characterized northern warriors. He was not as technically perfect as some of the southern knights, who had spent years learning the refined points of tournament combat. But what he lacked in finesse he made up for in raw power and an absolute refusal to yield. Brandon's matches were exciting to watch because of his style, which involved taking risks that more cautious knights would never attempt. He would lean far out of his saddle to get a better angle for his strike, would charge with reckless speed, would seemingly ignore his own safety in pursuit of victory. Sometimes this worked brilliantly, and he would score spectacular victories that brought the crowds to their feet. Other times it resulted in equally spectacular defeats, when an opponent exploited his aggression. Robert Baratheon did not compete in the joust, choosing instead to save his energy for the melee, where his particular skills would be more valuable. Robert was a formidable warrior, perhaps the strongest man in attendance at Harrenhal, capable of wielding a warhammer that most men could barely lift. But the joust required a specific kind of skill and precision that was different from the kind of fighting Robert preferred. In the chaos of a melee where strength and endurance mattered as much as technique, Robert would be in his element. In the joust, where everything depended on a single moment of impact while travelling at high speed, he was less comfortable. So Robert watched from the stands, cheering for his foster brother Ned Stark when Ned competed, though Ned was eliminated relatively early as jousting was not his greatest strength. Robert cheered for Brandon Stark as well, the brother of his betrothed, hoping that House Stark would be well represented in the tournament even if he himself was not competing. And Robert drank as he always did at such gatherings, consuming wine in quantities that would have rendered most men insensible, but which merely made Robert louder and more jovial. The tournament progressed over days, each day bringing new matches, new eliminations, the field of competitors growing smaller as the most skilled or most fortunate advanced toward the final rounds. Between the jousting sessions, there were other entertainments. Minstrels performed songs about famous knights and legendary tournaments. Jugglers and acrobats entertained the crowds. Merchants sold food and drink, ribbons and favours, anything that people might purchase in the excitement of the moment. In the evenings there were feasts, though not every night, as even Lord Went's resources, or whoever was truly financing the tournament had limits. On the nights when there were feasts, the great hall of Harrenhal would fill with nobility, long tables laden with food and drink, courses succeeding each other in the elaborate manner that such occasions demanded. There would be multiple meats, fish, fowl, and game, prepared in various ways to demonstrate the skills of the cooks. There would be vegetables and fruits, though these were less emphasized in Westerosi feasting culture. There would be breads and pastries, pies and tarts, and there would be wine, rivers of wine from the Arbor and from Dorne and from across the narrow sea. At these feasts, the political work of the tournament continued. Lords spoke with each other about alliances and marriages, about trade and about disputes that needed resolution. Ladies discussed their children and their households, sharing information and gossip that was often as politically significant as the formal negotiations of their husbands and fathers. Young people flirted and danced, beginning romances that might or might not lead anywhere, enjoying the freedom that such gatherings provided to interact with potential matches from other regions. Prince Rhaegar was often present at these feasts. Though he seemed less engaged with the revelry than many others, he would sit at the high table with his wife Elia, conversing with her and with those seated nearby. But there was a distracted quality to his attention, as if part of his mind was elsewhere. Sometimes he would bring his harp and play for the assembled guests, and when he did, the hall would fall quiet, everyone listening to the melancholy beauty of his music. Elia, for her part, seemed to genuinely enjoy the social aspects of the tournament more than her husband did. She would speak warmly with other ladies, would ask about their families and their lands, would show interest in their concerns. Despite her physical frailty, which was evident to anyone who observed her carefully, she maintained her duties as princess with grace and kindness. She represented Dorne at the tournament, and in her gentle way, she worked to strengthen the bonds between her homeland and the rest of the realm. As the tournament advanced, certain knights began to emerge as the likely champions, those who had won consistently, and who seemed to be hitting their peak at exactly the right moment. Sir Arthur Dayne was among them, having defeated every opponent he faced with impressive skill. Sir Barristan Selmy continued to advance despite his age, proving that experience and technique could overcome the advantages of youth. Prince Rhaegar was still in the competition, having won his matches through solid performance even if he had not been spectacular. There were surprises too, knights who had not been expected to advance far but who found themselves in the later rounds through a combination of skill, luck, and the random nature of tournament brackets. Some of these unlikely contenders had caught the imagination of the crowds, becoming favourites precisely because they were underdogs, because their success seemed to prove that glory was not reserved only for the great and famous. The atmosphere at Harrenhal during these days of competition was extraordinary, unlike anything most of those present had ever experienced. Thousands of people gathered together, united by their interest in the tournament, creating a kind of temporary community that transcended the usual boundaries of region and status. Yes, the hierarchies remained. The lords sat apart from the commons, but they were all watching the same spectacles, all invested in the outcomes, all part of something larger than themselves. In the practice yards and in the areas where the knights prepared for their matches, there was constant activity. Squires worked to maintain their knights' armour and weapons, checking for damage after each match, making repairs, ensuring that everything would be perfect for the next competition. Horses were cared for with meticulous attention, as a knight's life often depended on his mount, particularly in the joust where the horse's speed and steadiness were crucial. Grooms walked the destriers to cool them down after matches, examined them for injuries, fed them and watered them, and generally attended to their every need. The betting on tournament outcomes was extensive and sometimes heavy. Men wagered gold on their favourite knights, and fortunes changed hands based on the outcomes of individual matches. Some made careful, informed bets based on their assessment of the knight's skills. Others bet on sentiment, supporting knights from their own region or house regardless of the odds, and some simply gambled recklessly, caught up in the excitement of the moment, making wagers they could ill afford to lose on outcomes that were inherently unpredictable. As the tournament moved toward its final rounds, as the field of competitors narrowed to the very best, the excitement built. Who would win? Would it be one of the famous names, one of the legendary knights whose reputations preceded them? Or would there be an upset, some relative unknown rising to claim the ultimate prize? The uncertainty was part of what made it compelling. The knowledge that despite all the skill and training and preparation, the outcome could not be perfectly predicted. That chance always played its role in human affairs. The matches in the later rounds were longer and harder fought, as the remaining competitors were all skilled and experienced, all capable of winning. The margin between victory and defeat became smaller, sometimes coming down to tiny errors or moments of luck. A horse stumbling slightly at the wrong instant could mean the difference between success and failure. A lance striking an inch to the left or right of where the knight intended could change the outcome. The physical toll on the remaining knights was evident as they competed match after match, accumulating bruises and strains, pushing their bodies beyond what was comfortable or perhaps wise. And through it all, the watchers watched. The crowds cheered and gasped, the nobility observed with critical eyes, and Harrenhal bore witness to this great gathering in its vast and partially ruined walls. The tournament was everything it had been promised to be, a spectacular display of martial skill and noble pageantry, a gathering that would be remembered and spoken of for generations. But the true significance of what was happening at Harrenhal had not yet revealed itself, had not yet occurred. The moment that would change everything, that would transform this tournament from merely memorable to historically pivotal, was still to come, waiting in the final competitions, in a crown of blue winter roses, in a gesture that no one would anticipate. The tournament had reached its culmination, its final rounds where only the most skilled and fortunate knights remained to compete for the ultimate prizes and glory. The atmosphere around Harrenhal had intensified over the days of competition, building toward this moment when champions would be crowned and the tournament would reach its resolution. The crowds were larger than ever, swelled by those who had arrived late, or who had been waiting specifically for the finals, when the very best would face each other and demonstrate the heights of martial skill that human training could achieve. The final matches of the joust were scheduled to take place over 2 days, allowing time between them for the knights to rest and recover, for the anticipation to build even further, and for the elaborate ceremonies that would accompany the crowning of the champion. The remaining competitors represented a mixture of the expected and the surprising, of legendary names and relative unknowns who had fought their way through the brackets to stand among the elite. Prince Rhaegar had advanced to the final rounds, his consistent performance through the tournament having carried him forward, even if he had not been the most dominant or spectacular competitor. There was something almost inevitable about his presence in the finals, as if the story of the tournament required that the prince be there at its climax, competing for the crown that would make him champion. Whether this reflected genuine skill, or whether some of his opponents had perhaps not fought quite as hard against the heir to the throne as they might have against others, was a question that circulated in whispers, but could never be definitively answered. Sir Barristan Selmy had also reached the finals, his legendary status confirmed once again by his ability to compete with and defeat men half his age. Barristan's continued success was inspiring to watch, a reminder that skill and experience could compensate for the declining physical capabilities that came with age. He moved more slowly than he once had, certainly, and there was a stiffness to him after matches that suggested his body was feeling every impact. But his eyes remained sharp, his lance arm steady, and his tactical understanding of tournament combat as refined as ever. Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, had advanced as most observers had expected, having dominated his matches with the kind of effortless superiority that separated the truly great from the merely very good. Arthur seemed to be enjoying himself in a quiet way, taking pleasure in the exercise of skill, in the testing of abilities, in the pure competition of it. He showed no signs of fatigue or injury despite the accumulated impacts of multiple jousts, his conditioning and natural resilience carrying him through without apparent difficulty. The final matches were extraordinary to witness, the culmination of days of competition, the best facing the best with everything at stake. The details of exactly who faced whom in what order vary somewhat in different accounts of the tournament, as is often the case with events that become legendary. Some sources say that Rhaegar faced Barristan in the semi-final, while Arthur faced another competitor. Others arrange the brackets differently. What all accounts agree on is that the final came down to Prince Rhaegar facing someone of tremendous skill, and that Rhaegar emerged victorious. The most common version of the story, the one that has been repeated most often, and which carries the weight of tradition even if we cannot verify absolutely, says that Rhaegar defeated Sir Barristan Selmy in the final joust. This would have been a victory of enormous significance, not merely because Barristan was a legend, but because defeating him would have required Rhaegar to be at his absolute best, to perform at a level that proved his worthiness for the victory beyond any doubt. The match between them, if this version is accurate, would have been watched with intense interest by everyone present. On one side, the prince, representing the future of House Targaryen, carrying the hopes of those who saw in him a potential solution to the problem of his father's madness. On the other side, the legendary knight, symbol of an earlier age of Targaryen glory, a man who had served the crown with absolute loyalty through multiple reigns. It was in some ways a contest between generations, between what had been and what might be. The technical details of how Rhaegar achieved his victory are not recorded in the histories with perfect clarity. We know that it was a hard-fought contest, that Barristan did not yield easily, that multiple passes were required before a clear victor emerged. We know that both knights struck true in several exchanges, that lances splintered against shields, that both nearly fell but managed to maintain their seats through skill and determination. And we know that ultimately Rhaegar's lance found its mark in a way that unseated Barristan, sending the older knight to the ground and securing the prince's victory. The crowd's reaction was complex, reflecting the mixed emotions that such an outcome provoked. There was celebration for Rhaegar, cheering for the prince who had proven himself worthy of the crown he would receive. But there was also applause for Barristan, recognition of his incredible performance, appreciation for what he had accomplished at an age when most men would not even attempt to compete. Both knights had demonstrated the qualities that made tournament competition meaningful, the courage and skill and determination that people celebrated when they celebrated chivalry. Barristan, rising from his fall with the assistance of his squires, removed his helm and approached Prince Rhaegar, offering his congratulations with the grace that had always characterized his conduct. There was no bitterness in his manner, no suggestion that he felt the outcome was unjust, or that Rhaegar's victory was anything other than earned. Barristan had competed, had given his best effort, and had been defeated by someone who on that day had fought better. This was the nature of tournaments, of competition, and Barristan accepted it with the dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. Rhaegar's response to his victory was characteristically muted. He did not celebrate exuberantly, did not raise his lance in triumph or circle the field acknowledging the crowd's cheers. Instead, he seemed almost sombre, as if the victory had brought him less joy than one might expect. Perhaps he was simply exhausted from the accumulated effort of multiple matches. Perhaps winning was something he had expected and therefore did not warrant excessive celebration. Or perhaps, as some who observed him closely suggested, his mind was already on what came next, on the ceremony that would follow, on a decision he had made about something that had nothing to do with the joust itself. The victor of the joust, according to long tradition, earned the right to crown a queen of love and beauty, to select a lady from among those present and honour her with a crown of flowers. This was one of the most anticipated moments of any tournament, a romantic gesture that combined martial victory with courtly love, that allowed the champion to publicly acknowledge someone who had captured his attention or his admiration. The choice of whom to crown was always significant, always analysed by observers for what it revealed about alliances and affections, about politics and personal feelings. The crown that had been prepared for this moment was made of blue winter roses, flowers from the north. From near the wall where the strange magic of those lands made flowers bloom, even in the harshest conditions. Winter roses were pale blue, almost silver in certain lights, and they carried a subtle, sweet scent that was distinctive and memorable. The choice of winter roses for the crown, rather than the more common roses from southern gardens, was itself somewhat unusual, requiring that someone had specifically arranged for these northern flowers to be brought to Harrenhal. Who had made this arrangement, and why, was another of the small mysteries surrounding the tournament. The ceremony of crowning the Queen of Love and Beauty would take place before all the assembled nobility and common folk, a public performance that everyone present would witness and remember. Rhaegar was given the crown of blue winter roses, and he rode slowly along the list toward where the high-born ladies sat in their places of honour, watching to see whom he would choose. The expectation, the assumption that everyone made, was that he would crown his wife Elia Martell. This was what custom and courtesy demanded, what a married prince should do, what would honour both his wife and her homeland of Dorne. Elia sat in her place, clearly visible, wearing the colours of House Martell, the sun and spear of dawn displayed on her garments. She was smiling, perhaps anticipating the honour that would be hers, perhaps simply enjoying the moment and the spectacle. Beside her and around her sat other ladies of high birth, each beautiful in her own way, each dressed in her finest garments, each representing her house and her region. Among them, though not immediately beside Elia, sat Lyanna Stark. Lyanna was wearing northern colours, greys and whites, simpler in style than the elaborate southern fashions, but striking in their clean lines and honest presentation. Her dark hair was loose or perhaps bound simply, in the northern style that did not favour the complex arrangements that southern ladies often wore. She was watching the ceremony like everyone else, interested but perhaps not anticipating that she would be the focus of what was about to happen. After all, she was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, not yet married but promised. And she was a Stark, northern and young, and not someone whom a crown prince would have any particular reason to honour. Rhaegar rode toward the section where Elia sat, and for a moment it seemed that everything would proceed as expected, that he would stop before his wife and place the crown of blue winter roses in her lap, that the tournament would conclude with the appropriate gesture of marital devotion. But then, in a moment that would be frozen in memory, that would be recounted and analysed and argued about for generations, Rhaegar rode past Elia. He rode past his wife, past the woman who had given him 2 children, past the Princess of Dorne who sat expecting to be honoured, and he continued along the list to where Lyanna Stark sat. The silence that fell over Harrenhal was profound, a shocked hush, as everyone present tried to process what they were witnessing. Rhaegar stopped before Lyanna Stark, and with everyone watching. With thousands of eyes upon him, he reached out with his lance and gently placed the crown of blue winter roses in her lap. The gesture was unmistakable, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne, married man and father of 2, had chosen Lyanna Stark, betrothed to another man, to be his Queen of Love and Beauty. The reactions to this gesture varied wildly depending on who was reacting and what they brought to the interpretation of it. Some saw it as a romantic gesture, the kind of bold declaration that belonged in songs about knights and ladies, a prince honouring a maiden whose qualities had impressed him. Perhaps he was acknowledging her courage. if he had indeed discovered that she was the Knight of the Laughing Tree. Perhaps he had been moved by something he had observed in her, some quality of spirit or character that he wished to honour publicly. Others saw it as a terrible insult, a shocking breach of propriety that dishonoured multiple people simultaneously. Elia Martell had been publicly humiliated, passed over by her own husband in favour of another woman, and this in front of the entire realm. Lyanna's betrothed, Robert Baratheon, had been slighted, his intended bride honoured by another man in a gesture that carried unmistakable romantic implications. Lord Stark's family had been put in an awkward position, associated with something that looked very much like the beginning of scandal. Still others saw it as politically significant, perhaps even dangerous. Was Rhaegar making some kind of statement about northern-southern relations, about building new alliances? Was this connected to the theory that the tournament had been called to discuss what to do about King Aerys? That Rhaegar was signalling something to the Northern Lords about his intentions? Or was it simply inexplicable, the kind of impulsive action that made no political sense and which could only be understood as personal, emotional, perhaps even reckless? Lyanna herself, receiving the crown, seemed surprised, perhaps even shocked. The accounts vary on exactly how she reacted in that moment. Some say she blushed deeply, that her face showed confusion and perhaps pleasure. Others say she appeared distressed, that she understood immediately how problematic this gesture was. Still others say she maintained her composure, accepting the crown with northern dignity, revealing nothing of what she felt. What we can be certain of is that she did not refuse the crown, did not throw it back or create a public scene. She accepted it, and in accepting it, she became part of whatever story Rhaegar's gesture was beginning. Elia Martell's reaction was watched carefully by those near enough to observe her. Here too the accounts differ. Some say she maintained a perfect composure, that her face showed nothing of what she might have felt, that she bore the public slight with the grace expected of a princess. Others say her smile faltered, that for a moment her hurt was visible before she controlled it, that those who knew her could see the pain even as she tried to hide it. The Dornish lords and ladies in attendance, her brother's men and the knights who had travelled from Dorne to support their princess, were said to be visibly angry, though they could do nothing in the moment except watch. Robert Baratheon's reaction was less controlled. Robert had been drinking, as he often did at such gatherings, and when he saw Rhaegar crown his betrothed, saw another man honour Lyanna in a way that carried unmistakable romantic undertones, his fury was immediate and visible. Those sitting near him said he half rose from his seat, that his face darkened with rage, that he looked as if he might charge down to the lists and confront Rhaegar directly. Only the intervention of his friends, of Ned Stark and others who grabbed his arms and spoke urgently to him, prevented Robert from creating an even greater scene. Ned Stark himself was caught in a terrible position, torn between his foster brother whom he loved and his sister who had been honoured in this problematic way. Ned understood immediately how dangerous this gesture was, how many ways it could be interpreted, and how few of those interpretations were good. He was worried for Lyanna, worried about what this meant for her reputation and her future. He was worried about Robert's rage and what it might lead to, and he was confused, trying to understand why Rhaegar had done this, what the prince could possibly have been thinking. Brandon Stark, the Wild Wolf, was furious in the uncomplicated way that characterized his reactions to things. Someone had dishonoured his sister, or honoured her in a way that looked like dishonour, and Brandon's instinct was to respond with violence. Like Robert, he had to be restrained by those around him, had to be talked down from immediately confronting the prince. Brandon was never one to think through consequences before acting, and in this moment his natural inclination was to defend his sister's honour in the most direct way possible, regardless of the fact that the person who had insulted her was the heir to the throne. Lord Rickard Stark, the father and head of the family, maintained a more measured response, at least outwardly. Rickard was experienced in politics, understood that public reactions to provocations could make situations worse rather than better. But those who knew him could see that he was deeply troubled, that his mind was working through the implications of what had just happened, calculating how to respond in a way that would protect his daughter and his house, without creating an incident that could spiral into something larger. The ceremony continued because it had to, because everyone was in public and the forms had to be observed even as the underlying situation had become intensely awkward. There were other champions to be crowned, winners of the melee and the archery and the other competitions, but the heart had gone out of the celebration, the joy replaced by confusion and tension. People went through the motions, applauded at the appropriate moments, but the easy pleasure that had characterized the tournament had been disrupted by Rhaegar's gesture. In the immediate aftermath, in the hours and days that followed, Harrenhal was full of urgent conversations, of lords and ladies trying to understand what had happened and what it meant. Some tried to minimize it, to suggest that Rhaegar had simply wanted to honor a brave young woman, that the gesture had been misinterpreted, that it meant nothing beyond a chivalric acknowledgement. Others insisted it was far more serious, that Rhaegar had revealed an infatuation that was inappropriate and dangerous, that he had humiliated his wife and insulted House Stark and Robert Baratheon in ways that demanded response. The Dornish were particularly angry, feeling that their princess had been insulted before the entire realm. Dorne had joined the Seven Kingdoms through marriage rather than conquest. And the Dornish always watched carefully to ensure that they were treated with proper respect. This public slight to Elia seemed to many Dornish men to be a slight to Dorne itself, a suggestion that the prince valued a northern girl above his Dornish wife. The anger in the Dornish camps was palpable, though their Prince Doran was not present to moderate or direct it, having remained in Dorne due to the gout that plagued him. Some tried to speak with Rhaegar, to ask him what he had meant by the gesture, to understand his intentions. But Rhaegar retreated into his characteristic reserve, speaking politely but revealing nothing of significance. He had crowned Lyanna as Queen of Love and Beauty, he said, because he judged her worthy of the honour. When pressed for more explanation, he would simply repeat some version of this statement, refusing to elaborate, leaving others to speculate about what lay beneath his words. Lyanna herself was in a difficult position. She'd been honoured in a way that young women dreamed of, crowned Queen of Love and Beauty by a prince at the greatest tournament of the age. In songs and stories, this would be the beginning of a romance, a moment of pure joy. But in reality, it had placed her at the centre of a situation that was politically fraught and personally complicated. She was betrothed to Robert, a betrothal she had accepted even if she had reservations about it. She was her father's daughter, expected to behave in ways that honoured House Stark. And now she had been publicly associated with the Crown Prince in a way that invited scandal and speculation. What passed between Rhaegar and Lyanna after the crowning, if anything, is lost to history. Did they speak privately? Did he explain to her why he had made that choice? Did she express anger or pleasure or confusion? We cannot know because whatever conversations might have occurred were not recorded, were kept private or perhaps never happened at all. All we can know is what happened publicly, and what happened publicly was enough to change the trajectory of both their lives and the lives of countless others. The tournament at Harrenhal continued for a short time after the crowning, but the energy had shifted. People were no longer focused primarily on the competitions and the celebrations. Instead, they were focused on the implications of what Rhaegar had done, on the political and personal ramifications that might follow. Lords began departing earlier than they might have otherwise, eager to return to their own lands, to be away from a situation that felt increasingly unstable. The false spring that had blessed the tournament with such beautiful weather began to break. The unseasonable warmth that had made everything feel magical started to fade, replaced by more typical temperatures for that time of year, by clouds and a chill in the air that reminded everyone that winter was always coming eventually. The metaphor was too obvious to miss. The false spring, like the tournament itself, had been beautiful but temporary, a brief moment of warmth before the cold returned. As the gathered nobility dispersed from Harrenhal, travelling back to their various regions, they carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. The tournament would be spoken of for years, for generations, but not primarily because of the martial competitions, not because of who had won the joust or the melee. Instead, it would be remembered for that moment when Prince Rhaegar had placed a crown of blue winter roses in Lyanna Stark's lap, for the gesture that had somehow concentrated within it all the tensions of the realm, all the personal and political complexities that would soon explode into war. There were those who saw the crowning as the moment when the realm's fate was sealed, when the chain of events that would lead to Robert's rebellion became inevitable. There were others who argued that what followed was not inevitable at all, that different choices made afterward could have led to different outcomes. But what no one could dispute was that something had changed at Harrenhal, that the world after the crowning was different from the world before it, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, in crowning Lyanna Stark his Queen of Love and Beauty, had made a choice whose consequences he could not possibly have fully understood. Whether he acted from love or admiration, or political calculation or simple impulse, whether he meant to begin something or simply to acknowledge something he felt, his action had rippled out into the world and would continue to ripple, generating waves that would crash over Westeros and reshape it entirely. The blue winter roses, symbol of the North, placed in the lap of a northern girl by a prince of the South, would become one of the most famous images in Westerosi history, reproduced in songs and stories, analysed by maesters, mourned by those who understood what followed from it. And Lyanna Stark, 16 years old, crowned Queen of Love and Beauty at the greatest tournament of her age, would never return to Winterfell, would never marry Robert Baratheon, would never live the life that had been planned for her. The crown of blue winter roses would mark her as surely as any prophecy, would bind her to a fate that no one present at Harrenhal could have predicted, would make her name remembered long after she herself was gone. But all of that lay ahead, hidden in the future. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the crowning, there was only confusion and speculation, tension and worry, and the slow dispersal of the gathering as people returned to their homes, not yet knowing that many of them would soon be at war. The dispersal from Harrenhal was neither as joyful nor as orderly as the gathering had been. Where lords and ladies had arrived in high spirits, eager for the spectacle and celebration, many now departed troubled, sensing that something had gone wrong in ways they could not quite articulate, but which felt ominous nonetheless. The pavilions came down. The temporary city of canvas and rope that had grown around the castle dissolved back into its component parts, and the roads leading away from Harrenhal filled with travellers heading back to their various homes and holdings across the Seven Kingdoms. The weeks and months following the tournament passed with a strange quality, a sense of waiting for something, though no one could quite say what they were waiting for. Life returned to its normal patterns in castles throughout Westeros. Lords attended to their responsibilities, managing their lands, dispensing justice, collecting taxes. Ladies supervised their households, arranged marriages for their children, maintained the complex social networks that bound the nobility together. Knights trained and hunted and performed the duties required of them. And yet beneath this normality, there was an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that the stability everyone took for granted was perhaps more fragile than they had assumed. In the months following Harrenhal, sometime in the latter part of 281, or perhaps in the early months of 282 years after the conquest, the event occurred that would set the realm on its path toward open war. Lyanna Stark disappeared. The circumstances of her disappearance, like so many aspects of this story, remain disputed and unclear, obscured by the propaganda and conflicting accounts that emerged afterward when everyone involved had reasons to present events in ways that supported their positions. The version that spread most widely, the one that Robert Baratheon would believe, and that would fuel his rage, was that Lyanna had been abducted by Prince Rhaegar. According to this account, Rhaegar and several companions encountered Lyanna travelling somewhere in the Riverlands, seized her against her will, and carried her off to some unknown location. This was seen as the act of a prince who had developed an obsession with the northern girl he had crowned at Harrenhal, who had decided to take what he wanted regardless of propriety or honour, who had violated every code of chivalric behaviour by kidnapping a highborn maiden who was betrothed to another. The alternative version, which would be whispered quietly and which some believed, was that Lyanna had gone with Rhaegar willingly, that she had chosen to run away with the prince, though what looked like abduction was actually elopement. This version suggested that Lyanna and Rhaegar had fallen in love, or believed they had, that the crowning at Harrenhal had been an expression of genuine feeling rather than mere gallantry, that both of them had been willing to abandon their duties and obligations for the sake of what they felt for each other. Each version of the story had implications that were difficult to accept. If Rhaegar had truly abducted Lyanna, then the heir to the Iron Throne was a criminal and a villain, someone who had betrayed every principle he supposedly stood for, who had dishonoured himself and his family in the worst possible way. If Lyanna had gone willingly, then she had abandoned her betrothal, rejected the husband her father had chosen for her, brought shame upon House Stark, and demonstrated a shocking disregard for the obligations that bound noble daughters to their families. The truth, whatever it was, remained known only to those directly involved, and they were not available to explain themselves. Lyanna was gone, Rhaegar was gone, and the few companions who might have witnessed what actually happened either could not be found or would not speak about it, and so people believed what made sense to them based on their own understandings of the characters involved and their own needs regarding what the story meant. Robert Baratheon believed absolutely that Lyanna had been abducted, that she would never have gone with Rhaegar willingly, that she had been taken by force and was being held against her will. For Robert, this made Rhaegar not merely a rival but a monster, someone who had stolen the woman Robert loved, who had committed an unforgivable crime that demanded vengeance. Robert's love for Lyanna, whether or not she had ever truly returned it, was genuine and intense, and the thought of her in Rhaegar's hands filled him with a fury that would not be cooled or reasoned with. Eddard Stark, who knew his sister better than Robert did, was less certain about what had actually happened. Ned understood that Lyanna had her own will, her own desires, that she was not passive or helpless. He knew she had reservations about Robert, about his character and his faithfulness. He could imagine, though he might not have wanted to admit it, that Lyanna might have been attracted to Rhaegar, might have seen in the melancholy prince something that appealed to her in ways that Robert's boisterous passion did not. But Ned also knew that whether Lyanna had gone willingly or been taken by force, she was in danger, that the situation was explosive, that his sister needed help. Brandon Stark's reaction to his sister's disappearance was immediate and characteristic. Brandon was the wild wolf, a man of action and passion, someone who confronted problems directly rather than waiting and considering. When Brandon learned that his sister was missing and that Prince Rhaegar was implicated in her disappearance, he did not pause to gather more information, or to consult with his father, or to think through the consequences of his actions. Instead, he rode immediately for King's Landing with several companions, intent on confronting the prince and demanding the return of his sister. Brandon's ride to King's Landing was fueled by righteous anger and a sense of family honour that demanded immediate action. He arrived at the Red Keep and shouted for Prince Rhaegar to come out and die, challenging the heir to the throne to single combat, demanding justice for his sister. It was a bold gesture, perhaps even admirable in its directness and its refusal to accept that Lyanna's disappearance should go unchallenged. But it was also extraordinarily dangerous, a direct challenge to the royal family made publicly in the Crown's own seat of power, and it would have consequences that Brandon could not have anticipated in his anger. But Prince Rhaegar was not at the Red Keep. He was wherever he'd gone with or without Lyanna, and so Brandon's challenge went unanswered by the person to whom it was directed. Instead, it was heard by King Aerys, and the Mad King's response revealed just how far his paranoia and cruelty had progressed. Rather than treating Brandon's outburst as the understandable reaction of a brother worried for his sister, rather than attempting to calm the situation or explain what had happened, Aerys ordered Brandon arrested for treason. The charge of treason was based on Brandon's public challenge to Rhaegar, his threat to kill the heir to the throne, his disruption of the king's peace. By the strict letter of the law, Aerys perhaps had grounds for the arrest, as threatening to kill the crown prince could be construed as treason. But wise kings had always understood that there was a difference between hot words spoken in anger and actual treasonous conspiracy, that sometimes it was better to diffuse tensions rather than escalate them, that turning angry young lords into prisoners was not the path to stability. Aerys, however, was not a wise king. He was a mad king, someone whose judgment could not be trusted, who saw threats everywhere and who responded to perceived challenges with disproportionate cruelty. Brandon was arrested along with the companions who had ridden with him to King's Landing, and they were thrown into the dungeons beneath the Red Keep to await the king's justice, which had become something to be feared rather than hoped for. Lord Rickard Stark, learning that his eldest son had been arrested in King's Landing, was faced with a terrible situation. His daughter was missing, possibly abducted by the Crown Prince. His heir was imprisoned by the king on charges of treason. The careful political position that House Stark had maintained, their loyalty to the Iron Throne balanced with their fierce independence, was suddenly in jeopardy. Rickard knew he had to go to King's Landing himself, had to try to resolve this situation before it spiralled further out of control. Rickard Stark travelled to King's Landing and demanded a trial, which was his right as a great lord of the realm. The laws of Westeros provided that noblemen accused of crimes were entitled to defend themselves, either through testimony and evidence or through trial by combat if they chose. Rickard arrived at the capital expecting some form of judicial process, however biased it might be, expecting that he would have an opportunity to speak on his son's behalf, to explain that Brandon had acted from understandable emotion rather than treasonous intent, to negotiate some resolution. What happened instead was an atrocity that would stain the Targaryen name forever, and that would demonstrate beyond any doubt that Aerys had descended into complete madness. The trial that Aerys granted was a mockery of justice, a cruel perversion of the very concept of a fair hearing. The exact details of what occurred in the throne room that day vary in the telling, but the essential horror is consistent across all accounts. Brandon was brought before the throne with a device around his neck, some kind of strangulation mechanism that would tighten if he struggled. Rickard was present as well, and rather than being allowed to defend his son through combat as was his right, rather than being given a chance to prove Brandon's innocence through the trial, by combat that Rickard demanded, Aerys declared that fire would be the champion for House Targaryen. Rickard Stark was suspended from the rafters of the throne room in his armour, and wildfire was lit beneath him. The armour that should have protected Rickard Stark became an oven that cooked him alive. As his father burned and screamed, Brandon Stark was positioned with a sword just out of reach, the device around his neck arranged, so that his attempts to reach the sword to save his father only tightened the strangulation device. Brandon strangled himself trying to reach the sword, trying to save his father, while Rickard burned. Both men died in agony while Aerys watched, while members of the court were forced to witness this horror, while the entire edifice of law and custom that was supposed to protect nobles from arbitrary royal cruelty collapsed into ash. The executions of Rickard and Brandon Stark were not justice by any definition. They were murder, deliberate and cruel, carried out by a king who had lost all connection to reality, who saw enemies everywhere and who believed that terror was the appropriate response to any challenge to his authority. The manner of their deaths, the perverse mockery of trial by combat where fire represented the king's champion, The torture of making Brandon watch his father die while strangling himself in a futile attempt at rescue. All of this revealed a mind that was not merely unstable, but actively sadistic. News of what had happened in King's Landing spread throughout the realm with horrifying speed. The death of great lords was always significant, but these deaths were particularly shocking because of how they had occurred, because of what they revealed about the king, because of the precedent they set. If the Starks, one of the most ancient and respected houses in Westeros, could be murdered in such a fashion, then no one was safe. If trial by combat could be perverted into an excuse for torture and execution, then the laws that supposedly protected the nobility meant nothing. But Aerys was not finished, perhaps emboldened by having eliminated 2 Starks without consequence, perhaps driven by his paranoia to see conspiracy everywhere, perhaps simply following the logic of madness. The king sent commands to Jon Arryn, Lord of the Area and Warden of the East. Aerys demanded that Jon Arryn deliver to King's Landing the heads of his 2 wards, Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark. No charges were specified, no crimes alleged beyond their connection to Brandon and Rickard. Aerys simply wanted them dead, wanted to eliminate anyone who might seek vengeance for what had been done. This demand placed Jon Arryn in an impossible position. He was the foster father to these young men, had raised them, had formed bonds with them that were as strong as blood. He was also a lord sworn to serve the Iron Throne, bound by oaths of fealty to obey his king. Throughout the history of Westeros, these 2 obligations had rarely conflicted so directly. Lords were supposed to be loyal both to their king and to their own people, and the system worked as long as the king was reasonable, as long as royal commands did not require lords to betray those they had sworn to protect. But Aerys's command required exactly that betrayal. It required Jon Arryn to murder or cause to be murdered 2 innocent young men whose only crime was being related to, or friends with someone who had angered the king. It required him to participate in the kind of arbitrary tyranny that made mockery of everything that the feudal system claimed to stand for, that destroyed the bonds of trust and reciprocal obligation that held society together. Jon Arryn's decision would determine whether the realm descended into war, or whether Aerys's madness would be accepted and normalized. If Jon Arryn obeyed the king's command, if he delivered Robert and Ned to their deaths, then the message would be clear to every lord in Westeros that the king could kill anyone he wanted, for any reason or no reason at all, that no one was protected by law or custom, that the only safety lay in absolute submission to royal will, no matter how insane that will became. Jon Arryn refused. It was perhaps the most significant decision any lord would make in that generation, the choice that transformed what might have remained a series of atrocities into an open rebellion that set the realm on the path towards civil war. Jon Arryn said no to his king, rejected the command to murder his wards, and instead called his banners. The Vale of Arryn would go to war against the Iron Throne, and Jon Arryn invited Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark to join him in rebellion against the Mad King. Robert needed no persuasion. The woman he loved had been taken by the Crown Prince, his foster brother's father and brother had been murdered by the king, and now the king wanted him dead as well. Robert's rage found its target and its justification. He was not merely a spurned lover seeking vengeance, he was now a rebel with cause, someone fighting against tyranny and murder, someone who could claim to be defending the realm against a king who had forfeited his right to rule through his monstrous actions. Eddard Stark, who had lost his father and his older brother, who was now Lord of Winterfell though he had never expected to inherit, who worried desperately about his sister who was still missing, joined the rebellion as well. Ned was by nature more cautious than Robert, more inclined to seek peaceful solutions, but there could be no peaceful solution to what Aerys had done. Justice demanded that the king answer for his crimes, and justice would not be found by submitting to royal authority. The only path forward was through rebellion, through war, through the terrible necessity of overthrowing a king who could not be allowed to continue ruling. Thus began what history would call Robert's Rebellion, though it might equally have been called Jon Arryn's Rebellion, or the War of the Usurper depending on one's perspective. The immediate cause was Aerys's murder of the Starks and his demand for more heads, but the underlying causes reached further back, to years of increasing royal madness, to the tournament at Harrenhal and the questions it had raised, to Rhaegar's crowning of Lyanna and the disappearance that followed, to the slow erosion of trust between the crown and its great lords. The rebellion would consume the realm for the better part of 2 years, would result in thousands of deaths, would see famous battles and dramatic reversals of fortune, would ultimately result in the fall of House Targaryen after nearly 300 years of rule. But the detailed telling of that war, the battles and campaigns and political manoeuvrings, is perhaps a story for another time. Another quiet evening when we might explore how realms fall and how new ones rise from their ashes. What matters for our purposes, for this contemplation of the tournament at Harrenhal and its consequences, is understanding how the chain of causation unfolded. The tournament had been a gathering of the realm, perhaps the last peaceful gathering before everything changed. Rhaegar's crowning of Lyanna had been a gesture whose meaning remained ambiguous, but whose effects were undeniable, creating tensions and possibilities that had not existed before. Lyanna's disappearance, whether abduction or elopement, had sparked Brandon's rash confrontation with royal authority. And Aerys's mad response, his murder of the Starks and demand for more noble blood, had finally pushed the realm past the point where his rule could be tolerated. Each event had led to the next in a chain that seemed almost inevitable in retrospect, but which at each point had involved choices that might have been made differently. If Rhaegar had crowned Elia instead of Lyanna at Harrenhal, would events have unfolded differently? If Lyanna had refused to go with Rhaegar, or if he had never approached her, would Brandon have had cause to ride to King's Landing? If Aerys had been rational enough to diffuse the situation rather than escalating it, could war have been avoided? These questions cannot be answered definitively, but they remind us that history is made through human choices, that different decisions create different futures, that nothing is truly inevitable until it has already happened. The tournament at Harrenhal, which had seemed at the time to be a celebration, a gathering for joy and competition and political manoeuvring of the normal sort, was revealed in retrospect to have been something else entirely. It had been a moment of transition, a hinge point where the realm balanced between one future and another. The false spring that had blessed it with unseasonable warmth had been named truly. For the warmth had been temporary. The winter that followed would be long and harsh, and the realm that emerged from that winter would be transformed in ways that no one gathered at Harrenhal could have predicted. For those who had been present at the tournament, who had witnessed Rhaegar's crowning of Lyanna, who had seen the shocked reactions and felt the tension in the air, the memory would be bitter-sweet. They had witnessed history in the making, had been present at one of the defining moments of their age. But they had also witnessed the beginning of a catastrophe, had seen the seeds being planted that would grow into war and death, and the end of a dynasty that had seemed eternal. The blue winter roses that Rhaegar had used for Lyanna's crown became a symbol that would resonate through the years that followed, appearing in songs and stories, representing different things to different people. To some, they symbolized tragic love, the kind of doomed romance that belonged in the saddest ballads. To others, they represented recklessness and betrayal, the terrible consequences that followed when people put their own desires above their duties. To still others, they were a reminder of how small gestures can carry vast consequences, how a crown of flowers at a tournament can somehow lead to thousands dead and a realm transformed. Lyanna Stark never returned to Winterfell, never saw her home again after leaving it to attend the tournament at Harrenhal. What happened to her in the time between her disappearance and her eventual death remains one of the great mysteries of that period, a mystery that would have profound implications for the future, even if those implications were not understood at the time. She died young before the war's end in circumstances that were complicated and which Eddard Stark would never fully explain, in a place called the Tower of Joy in the Mountains of Dawn. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the melancholy prince who had seemed to represent the hope for a better future after his father's mad reign, died at the Battle of the Trident, struck down by Robert Baratheon's warhammer. Whatever Rhaegar had meant by crowning Lyanna, whatever had passed between them, whatever he had hoped to accomplish, died with him in the shallow waters of the river. The songs he had played on his harp, the prophecies he had studied, the destiny he believed he had to fulfill, all of it ended with Robert's hammer crushing his chest. King Aerys himself would die in his throne room in King's Landing, murdered by Jaime Lannister, the young Kingsguard knight who was supposed to protect him, but who instead killed him to prevent him from burning the entire city with wildfire. Jaime would be named the Kingslayer for this act, would be condemned by some and praised by others, would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. But the immediate result was clear. The Mad King was dead. House Targaryen had fallen, and Robert Baratheon would claim the Iron Throne. The great lords who had gathered at Harrenhal, who had jousted and feasted and made political plans, found themselves scattered and divided by the war that followed. Some fought for the king, maintaining their loyalty to House Targaryen even as Aerys's madness became undeniable. Others joined the rebellion, deciding that their oaths to a mad king were void, that the realm's safety required the king's removal. Still others tried to remain neutral, waiting to see how events would unfold before committing themselves, though neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain as the war progressed. Elia Martell, who had been publicly humiliated at Harrenhal when her husband crowned another woman, who had been set aside in ways that must have been deeply painful, met a horrible end in the sack of King's Landing. She and her children were murdered by Lannister men during the chaos when Tywin's forces entered the city, a crime that would poison relations between the new Baratheon regime and Dorne, that would leave scars that would last for generations. The princess, who had done nothing wrong, who had been a pawn in events she did not control, paid the ultimate price for her husband's choices and for the brutality of war. The tournament at Harrenhal had been a moment of pageantry and celebration, a gathering where the realm's nobility had come together to honour the ideals of chivalry and martial prowess. But the reality that emerged from it had nothing to do with those ideals. Instead, it revealed the darker truths about power and human nature, about how quickly civilization could break down, about how the veneer of courtly behaviour concealed ambitions and passions that could tear kingdoms apart. The songs that would be written about Harrenhal would be sad songs, songs of lost possibilities and tragic consequences, songs that tried to make sense of how something that began with a tournament could end with so much death. As we contemplate the tournament at Harrenhal and the catastrophe that followed, it seems worthwhile to pause and consider the individuals who were present, the lives that intersected at that gathering in the false spring, and what became of them in the years that followed. History tends to focus on the great events, on battles and political decisions, on the rise and fall of dynasties. But history is made by people, by individuals with their own hopes and fears, their own choices and consequences, and understanding what happened to those who witnessed Rhaegar's crowning of Lyanna helps us understand the full human cost of those events. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the man at the centre of so much of this story, lived less than 2 years after the tournament. The melancholy prince who had seemed to carry the weight of prophecy and destiny on his shoulders, who had played his harp and studied ancient texts, who had made the choice to crown Lyanna Stark with blue winter roses, met his end at the ford of the Trident. Robert Baratheon faced him there in single combat, while the armies of both sides watched, and Robert's warhammer crushed Rhaegar's breastplate, drove the rubies from his armour into the river where they would wash downstream, and killed the last Targaryen prince who might have been king. What Rhaegar was thinking in those final moments, whether he regretted his choices or stood by them, whether he died believing he had fulfilled his destiny or failed it, we cannot know. He fell in the river, the prince who had seemed to embody Targaryen glory and promise, and his death marked the effective end of his house's hold on the Iron Throne. even though his father still lived for a short time afterward. Some said Rhaegar's last word was Lyanna's name, though whether this is truth or romantic invention added by singers afterward is impossible to determine. Those who had known Rhaegar offered different assessments of his character and his choices. Sir Barristan Selmy, who had jousted against him at Harrenhal and who had served as his king's guard, remembered him as the finest man he had ever known, someone who combined martial skill with wisdom and genuine care for the realm. Others saw Rhaegar as someone who had allowed his obsession with prophecy to cloud his judgment, who had betrayed his wife and his duties in pursuit of something he believed was more important. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, as it usually does with complex human beings who make choices under difficult circumstances. Lyanna Stark, the girl who had been crowned Queen of Love and Beauty, who had disappeared with or been taken by Rhaegar, died in Dorne at a place called the Tower of Joy. The exact timing of her death is somewhat uncertain, but it occurred toward the end of the war or shortly after, before Robert had secured his throne, before the realm had fully transitioned to its new order. Eddard Stark found her there, along with several of Rhaegar's closest companions who had been guarding the tower, and what passed between them would remain one of the great mysteries of that period. Ned found his sister dying, and she made him promise something, words spoken in private that Ned would never reveal to anyone, not even to Robert. Not even to his own wife in later years. The nature of that promise has been the subject of endless speculation. Some believe Lyanna simply asked to be buried in Winterfell's crypts, to be brought home to the north. Others suspect the promise involved something more complicated, something that would explain why 3 of the finest knights in the realm, members of the King's Guard sworn to protect the royal family, had been at that tower in Dorne rather than with their king or prince during the war. Lyanna was 16 years old when she attended the tournament at Harrenhal, 17 or at most 18 when she died. She had lived barely into adulthood, had never married, had never had the chance to become the person she might have been if events had unfolded differently. She was buried in the crypts of Winterfell as she'd wished, her bones brought home by Ned, and a statue was erected in her memory, a young woman frozen in stone, forever the age she had been when everything changed. The songs that would be written about Lyanna presented her in various ways. Some portrayed her as a victim, an innocent maiden abducted by an obsessed prince, someone who died because of circumstances beyond her control. Others suggested she had been a willing participant in her own story, someone who had chosen love over duty and paid the price for that choice. The truth, as with Rhaegar, likely contained elements of both narratives and probably exceeded the simplified versions that songs and stories could contain. Robert Baratheon survived the war and became king, claiming the Iron Throne by right of conquest, and through a distant Targaryen connection on his grandmother's side that provided a thin veneer of legitimacy beyond simple military victory. But Robert never recovered from Lyanna's loss, never moved past his conviction that she had been stolen from him, that she had died because of what Rhaegar had done to her. He married Cersei Lannister as part of the political settlement that followed the war, a marriage that would prove loveless and bitter, and he spent the rest of his life mourning the woman he had loved or believed he had loved. Whether Lyanna had ever truly returned Robert's feelings remained unclear. Robert believed she had, convinced himself that they would have been happy together if only Rhaegar had not interfered. But those who had known Lyanna, including her own brother, had reservations about whether she'd felt the same way. Robert's love for Lyanna was real and intense, but it may have been largely one-sided, a passion that Lyanna tolerated because of her betrothal, but never fully reciprocated. In death, Lyanna became perfect in Robert's memory, an idealized figure who could never disappoint him the way real women inevitably did. Robert's reign as king would last nearly 17 years, until his death in a hunting accident that was perhaps not entirely accidental. He was never a particularly effective king, preferring to drink and hunt and joust rather than attend to the tedious work of governance. He left that work to his hand, to his small council, to others who actually cared about administration. But he had won the throne through conquest, had overthrown a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries, and in that sense his presence at Harrenhal, his witnessing of Rhaegar's crowning of his betrothed, had been the beginning of his path to kingship, even if the path had been paved with grief and rage. Eddard Stark became Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North after his father and brother's deaths, a position he had never expected to hold. Ned had been the second son, raised knowing that he would need to find his own way in the world, perhaps serving his brother as a loyal bannerman, perhaps being given some smaller holding to manage. But Brandon's death thrust Ned into leadership, and he carried that responsibility with the seriousness and honour that characterised everything he did. Ned married Catelyn Tully, who had been betrothed to Brandon but who was transferred to Ned after Brandon's death, a common practice when an heir died before marrying. The marriage was arranged as part of the political alliances that won the war, binding the North to the Riverlands, and it would prove to be a successful match despite its difficult beginning. Ned and Catelyn would have 5 children together, would build a life in Winterfell, would rule the North with justice and wisdom for nearly 15 years after the war's end. But Ned carried burdens that he shared with no one. The promise he had made to Lyanna weighed on him always, and whatever secrets he kept about her death and about what had happened at the Tower of Joy remained locked within him. He also carried the weight of having participated in a rebellion, of having helped overthrow his king even if that king had been mad and murderous. Ned believed in honour and duty, and the war had forced him into situations where those values had conflicted, where there had been no clearly right choice, only terrible options between which he had to select the least wrong. Brandon Stark, the wild wolf, the brother who had ridden to King's Landing to defend his sister's honour, died horribly in that throne room. Strangling himself while trying to save his father, he had been 20 years old, engaged to be married to Catelyn Tully, heir to one of the great houses of Westeros with his whole life ahead of him. His impetuousness, his refusal to wait and consider, his need to act immediately when his sister was threatened, had led directly to his death. Whether more careful consideration would have changed anything, whether a more measured approach could have prevented the catastrophe that followed, is one of those questions history cannot answer. Lord Rickard Stark died with his son, murdered by a king he had served loyally, cooked alive in his armour while being forced to watch Brandon's struggles. Rickard had been a careful lord, someone who made political alliances through marriage, who thought strategically about House Stark's position in the realm. He had arranged Brandon's betrothal to Catelyn Tully and Lyanna's to Robert Baratheon, creating connections between the North and other regions. But all his careful planning had been destroyed by events he could not have anticipated, by a prince's choice at a tournament and a king's descent into complete madness, Jon Arryn, who had made the crucial decision to refuse the king's command, who had chosen to protect his wards rather than obey his king, served as hand to King Robert for nearly 15 years after the war. Jon Arryn had been the true architect of the rebellion's success, using his political skill and the respect other lords had for him to build the coalition that defeated the Targaryens. Without Jon Arryn's leadership and legitimacy, the rebellion might have fragmented, might have failed to attract enough support to prevail. Jon Arryn was old by the time the war ended, and he spent his final years trying to govern a realm that Robert largely ignored, trying to hold together the peace that had been won through so much blood. He would eventually die under mysterious circumstances, and his death would set in motion the events that would lead to another war, another round of violence and chaos. But for the years he lived after the rebellion, he represented stability and wisdom, the steady hand that kept the realm functioning despite its often absent king. Sir Barristan Selmy, who had jousted against Rhaegar at Harrenhal, who had been a living legend even then, survived the war despite fighting for the losing side. Barristan had remained loyal to his vows, had continued to serve as Kingsguard even under Aerys's mad rule, had fought in the battles that followed. He was wounded at the Trident, the same battle where Rhaegar died, and was captured by the rebels. Robert, showing surprising mercy or perhaps recognising that Barristan's loyalty to his vows was something to be honoured rather than punished, pardoned him and invited him to continue serving in the Kingsguard. Barristan accepted and would serve King Robert and later Robert's heirs with the same absolute loyalty he had shown the Targaryens. He had been at Harrenhal as one of the finest knights in the realm, and he remained that even as he aged, even as the world changed around him. His presence provided continuity, a connection to the earlier age, a reminder that honour and duty could persist even when dynasties fell. He would live for many more years, would serve multiple kings, would eventually be dismissed in a way that dishonoured both him and those who dismissed him. But at Harrenhal he had been in his prime, a knight whose prowess was matched by his integrity. Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, died at the Tower of Joy, one of the 3 Kingsguard knights who had been guarding Lyanna Stark when Eddard Stark arrived. The details of what happened at that tower remained murky, deliberately obscured by those who survived. There had been a fight. That much was certain. Ned and his companions had fought the 3 Kingsguard, and in the end only Ned and one companion, Howland Reed, had survived on the rebel side, while all 3 Kingsguard had died. Arthur Dayne had been perhaps the finest knight of his generation, wielding the legendary sword Dawn, a man whose skill was such that stories told of him bordered on the mythical. That he and his 2 fellow Kingsguard had been at the Tower of Joy rather than fighting in the war, rather than protecting their king or their prince, suggested that whatever was happening at that tower was considered more important than anything else. Why they had chosen to fight Ned rather than yield, why they had died protecting whatever or whomever they were protecting, remained questions that only Ned and Howland Reed could answer, and neither spoke of it openly. Jaime Lannister, who had been so young at Harrenhal, newly appointed to the Kingsguard and eager to prove himself, became the Kingslayer when he murdered King Aerys in the throne room. Jaime had been present when Aerys killed the Starks, had been forced to watch and do nothing because his vows required him to obey the king. He had stood guard while Aerys descended further into madness, while the king made plans to burn King's Landing with wildfire rather than let Robert's forces take the city. In the end, Jaime made a choice. He killed the king he was sworn to protect, broke his most sacred vow, and in doing so likely saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But no one except Jaime knew about Aerys's plans to burn the city, because Jaime never explained his actions, never defended himself or justified what he had done. He was condemned as an oathbreaker, as someone who had betrayed the most fundamental duty a Kingsguard could have, and the name Kingslayer would follow him for the rest of his life. Jaime remained in the Kingsguard under Robert, though the irony was not lost on anyone that a man who had murdered the king he was supposed to protect was now serving a different king. Jaime's golden youth, his promise as the finest swordsman of his generation, had been tarnished by that single act, by the choice he'd made in Aerys's throne room. Whether it had been the right choice, whether he should be condemned or praised for it, was a question that would never have a universally accepted answer. Cersei Lannister, who had not attended Harrenhal because her father had kept her at Casterly Rock, became queen when she married Robert Baratheon. The marriage was arranged by her father Tywin as part of the settlement after the war, a way for Tywin to restore House Lannister to prominence after he had remained neutral through much of the conflict. Cersei had dreamed of marrying Prince Rhaegar, of becoming queen that way, and instead she got Robert, a man who loved a dead woman, and who would never truly love her. The marriage was poisonous from the start, characterised by resentment and infidelity on both sides. Cersei gave Robert 3 children, at least officially, though the truth of their parentage was complicated in ways that would eventually become significant. She became queen, but not in the way she had imagined, finding that the power and prestige she had craved came with profound unhappiness in her personal life. Her beauty and her ambition, the qualities that had seemed like they would guarantee her success, proved insufficient to give her what she truly wanted. Tywin Lannister, who had been absent from Harrenhal, made his appearance during the final stage of the war when he brought his forces to King's Landing and sacked the city. Tywin had waited throughout most of the conflict, maintaining his power at Casterly Rock while watching to see how events would unfold. Only when it became clear that Robert would win did Tywin commit his forces. And he did so in a way that ensured Robert would be indebted to him, while also demonstrating Lannister power through the brutal sack of the capital. It was Tywin's men who murdered Elia Martell and her children, a crime that Tywin almost certainly ordered even if he maintained deniability afterward. The murders were intended to prove to Robert that the Lannisters were loyal to the new regime, that they had no sympathy for the defeated Targaryens. But they also revealed Tywin's ruthlessness, his willingness to order the killing of children if it served his political purposes. Robert accepted Tywin's explanation and his service, making Tywin one of the most powerful figures in the new regime, but others, particularly the Dornish, never forgave those murders. Elia Martell, the gentle princess who had been humiliated at Harrenhal when her husband crowned another woman, died in the most horrifying way during the sack of King's Landing. The accounts of exactly what happened to her vary, and many are too terrible to relate in detail, but what is certain is that she was murdered along with her infant son and her young daughter. The Dornish belief that she was not merely killed, but brutalized before her death, that the manner of her dying was deliberately cruel, created a wound between Dorne and the new regime that would fester for years. Elia had done nothing wrong. She had been a faithful wife, a loving mother, someone who had fulfilled every duty required of her. Her health had been fragile after giving birth to Rhaegar's children, and she had been left in King's Landing rather than going with her husband wherever he had gone. She represented the innocent victims of the war, those who had made no choices that contributed to the conflict, but who suffered and died because of choices others made. Her death was perhaps the greatest crime of the entire war, and it was one for which no one was ever truly held accountable. Prince Oberyn Martell, Elia's younger brother, was in Essos during the war and returned to find his sister murdered. Oberyn's rage at what had been done to Elia would define much of his life afterward. He was convinced that Tywin Lannister had ordered her death, and that certain Lannister men had carried it out, and he spent years seeking some form of justice or vengeance. The Red Viper, as he was called, became a dangerous man to cross, someone whose skill with weapons was matched by his knowledge of poisons, someone who would eventually get his chance to fight for his sister's memory, even if the outcome was not what he hoped. Howland Reed, the small Crannog man who had been defended at Harrenhal by the mysterious Knight of the Laughing Tree, who had been befriended by the Stark children, survived the war and returned to the Neck. Howland had been one of Ned Stark's closest companions during the conflict, had fought beside him, had been present at the Tower of Joy when only he and Ned survived the confrontation with the Kingsguard. Whatever Howland knew about what had happened at that tower, whatever secrets he shared with Ned, he kept to himself. Howland would live on in his moving castle in the swamps, ruling the Crannog men, maintaining the ancient ways of the first men and the children of the forest. He was the only living person besides Ned who knew what had truly happened at the Tower of Joy, the only one who might have been able to explain the mysteries that surrounded Lyanna's death and the promise she had extracted from her brother. But Howland did not speak of it, and when Ned eventually died, Howland became the sole keeper of whatever secrets had been sealed at that tower in Dorne. The common people who had attended the tournament at Harrenhal, who had watched the joust and the crowning, who had witnessed history being made even if they did not understand it at the time, returned to their ordinary lives and eventually found themselves caught up in the war that followed. Soldiers were conscripted from farms and villages, farmers saw their crops burned by passing armies, merchants lost their livelihoods when trade routes became unsafe, families were torn apart by the conflict. The war affected everyone, from the highest lords to the lowest peasants, though the peasants had the least say in what happened and bore much of the cost. They did not care who sat on the Iron Throne, whether it was a mad Targaryen king or a warrior Baratheon king. What they cared about was whether they could plant their crops and harvest them without armies marching through their fields, whether they would have enough food for winter, whether their children would survive to adulthood. The great political questions that motivated the lords meant little to them except insofar as those questions determined whether there would be peace or war, stability or chaos. Some of those who had been present at Harrenhal as young people would tell their children and grandchildren about it in later years. They would describe the pageantry, the knights in their shining armour, the crowds and the excitement. They would talk about seeing Prince Rhaegar and the other famous figures of that age. And they would speak of the moment when Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Stark, how the entire gathering had fallen silent, how everyone knew that something significant had happened, even if they did not understand what it meant. These stories would become part of family histories, links to a moment when history had been made and ordinary people had been present to witness it. The tournament at Harrenhal had gathered thousands of people, from the greatest lords to the humblest servants, from famous knights to anonymous peasants. They had all been part of that moment in the false spring, all witnesses to events that would shape the realm's future, and in the years that followed, as war consumed Westeros, as dynasties fell and rose, as people made choices and lived with their consequences, the memory of that gathering would persist. Some remembered it with nostalgia, as a last moment of peace and celebration before everything went wrong. Others remembered it with bitterness, as the place where the seeds of disaster were planted. But all who'd been there remembered it, carried it with them, and in that sense the tournament lived on in memory long after the pavilions had come down and the crowds had dispersed. The fates of those who had gathered at Harrenhal remind us that history is not just about great events, but about individual lives, about people who make choices under constraints they do not fully understand, who act based on incomplete information and uncertain futures, who live and die leaving behind questions that can never be fully answered. The tournament was a moment when many lives intersected, when paths crossed and futures were altered, when decisions were made that would ripple outward through time in ways no one could have predicted. Understanding what became of those individuals, seeing how their stories unfolded after that gathering in the false spring, helps us grasp the full human dimensions of what happened, the personal costs and consequences that lay behind the grand historical narrative of dynastic change and civil war. Having traced the fates of those who gathered at Harrenhal, having seen how their lives unfolded in the years that followed that fateful tournament, it seems appropriate now to step back and consider how the event itself has been remembered, interpreted, and understood by those who came after. The tournament at Harrenhal exists in multiple forms: the actual historical event that occurred in the year of the false spring, the memories of those who were present, the accounts written down by maesters and chroniclers, the songs composed by minstrels, and the interpretations offered by those trying to understand how the world changed so dramatically in such a short time. The maesters of the citadel, those scholars who attempt to record and preserve history, have struggled with the tournament at Harrenhal in particular ways. On one level, the basic facts seem clear enough. Lord Walter Went announced a grand tournament in 281 years after the conquest. Thousands gathered at Harrenhal to witness competitions of martial skill. Prince Rhaegar won the joust and crowned Lyanna Stark as his Queen of Love and Beauty, instead of his wife Aelia. Within a year, the realm descended into civil war. These facts are not in dispute, but the meanings behind these facts, the motivations that drove the key actors, the chains of causation that connected one event to another, these remain matters of interpretation and debate. The Avasters have access to various sources, written accounts from those who were present, letters that survived from that period, testimony from survivors who lived long enough to be interviewed. But sources are always incomplete, always shaped by the perspectives and biases of those who created them, always leaving gaps that must be filled by inference and speculation. One of the central questions the Maesters have debated concerns the true purpose of the tournament. Was it simply what it claimed to be, a grand celebration organised by Lord Went to honour his daughter? The expense involved makes this explanation problematic, as does the timing, coming as it did at a moment when tensions in the realm were building. The theory that Prince Rhaegar was the true sponsor, that he intended to use the gathering to address the problem of his father's madness, has considerable support among historians, but cannot be definitively proven from the available evidence. If Rhaegar did intend to call an informal Great Council to sound out the great lords about deposing or restraining his father, then the tournament must be understood as a failed political maneuver, something that was either never attempted or that was attempted and rejected. Some maesters have suggested that Rhaegar's attention was diverted from his political purposes by his encounter with Lyanna Stark, that whatever he had planned to accomplish at Harrenhal was derailed by personal feelings that he had not anticipated. Others argue that the political manoeuvring did occur but happened in private conversations that were never recorded, that we simply lack access to what actually transpired in the pavilions and chambers where lords spoke away from public view. The question of the Night of the Laughing Tree has exercised considerable ingenuity among those trying to puzzle out the tournament's mysteries. The disappearance of the Mystery Knight before their identity could be established left a gap in the historical record that has been filled with various theories. The maesters have catalogued these theories, noting which have more or less evidence to support them, but without definitive proof, the mystery remains. The theory that Lyanna Stark was the Knight of the Laughing Tree has gained considerable currency over the years, supported by circumstantial evidence including her presence when Howland Reed was attacked, her known skill with horses, the timing of events, and the northern symbolism of the shield. But it requires accepting that a 16-year-old girl could have obtained armour, learned to joust well enough to defeat 3 experienced knights, and kept the secret from everyone including her own family. Some maesters find this plausible, others consider it romantic fantasy, and the debate continues. The alternative theory, that it was someone else entirely, perhaps Howland Reed using abilities that the Crannog men were rumoured to possess, or some hedge knight moved by a sense of justice, has its own adherents. The suggestion that Rhaegar discovered the knight's identity during his search has led to speculation about what he might have found and why he chose not to reveal it. If he did discover that Lyanna was the Mystery Knight, this would provide context for his later decision to crown her, would suggest that he had been impressed by her courage and skill in a way that influenced his actions at the tournament's conclusion. But the maesters must acknowledge uncertainty. They can present theories, can weigh evidence, can make arguments for various interpretations, but they cannot state with absolute confidence what happened regarding the Night of the Laughing Tree. And this uncertainty, this gap in knowledge, is something that historians must learn to live with. Not everything can be known, not every question can be answered, and part of the maester's craft is distinguishing between what can be stated confidently and what must remain speculative. The singers and minstrels who compose songs about the tournament at Harrenhal approached the events very differently from the maesters. Where the maesters sought accuracy and evidence, the singers sought emotional truth and narrative coherence. They took the basic facts and shaped them into stories that would move audiences, that would help people make sense of what had happened, that would give meaning to events that might otherwise seem random or inexplicable. The songs about Rhaegar and Lyanna tended toward the romantic, portraying their story as a tragic love affair between a noble prince and a spirited maiden. In these songs, Rhaegar crowns Lyanna because he has fallen deeply in love with her, has recognised in her something he has never found in anyone else. Lyanna returns his feelings, and they run away together not as a prince abducting a girl, but as lovers choosing each other despite the obstacles. The war that follows is portrayed as a terrible consequence of this love, a demonstration of how the personal feelings of individuals can have vast political implications when those individuals hold positions of power and influence. These romantic songs simplified complex realities, ignored uncomfortable questions, and created a narrative that was more beautiful and tragic than the truth likely was. But they served a purpose nonetheless. They helped people process what had happened, gave them a story they could understand and relate to, provided a framework for thinking about events that had been confusing and traumatic. The songs about Rhaegar and Lyanna became some of the most popular in Westeros, sung in taverns and great halls, learned by children, passed down through generations. Other songs took a different approach, portraying Rhaegar not as a romantic hero but as a villain who had abducted an innocent maiden, dishonoured his wife, and brought disaster upon the realm through his selfish actions. These songs were particularly popular in the Stormlands, and later anywhere that Robert's version of events held sway. They validated Robert's anger, justified the rebellion, and cast the war as a necessary response to Targaryen villainy, rather than as a morally complex conflict with fault on multiple sides. Still other songs focused on different aspects of the tournament. There were songs about Sir Barristan Selmy's prowess despite his age, about the Night of the Laughing Tree and the mystery that was never solved, about the pageantry and celebration before everything went wrong. These songs were less politically charged, serving more as entertainment and as ways of preserving the memory of what had been, by all accounts, an extraordinary gathering. The common people of Westeros, those who were not maesters or singers but simply farmers and craftsmen and merchants living their lives, developed their own understanding of what had happened at Harrenhal. For them, the tournament became a story about how the mighty could destroy the world through their passions and their conflicts. It was a cautionary tale about what happened when princes and lords put their personal desires above their duties, when the games of the powerful turned serious and spilled out to affect everyone. In taverns and at firesides, people told each other about Harrenhal, about the last great celebration before the war that had killed so many. They spoke of it with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness, remembering the excitement of that gathering while also blaming it for what had followed. Some saw it as proof that the nobility were fundamentally irresponsible, that giving so much power to people who could make such disastrous choices was itself a kind of madness. The interpretation of events at Harrenhal varied by region and by political affiliation. In the north, Lyanna Stark was remembered primarily as a victim, someone whose life had been destroyed by a prince's obsession, someone who had died far from home and far too young. The Starks themselves were careful in what they said publicly about Lyanna, protective of her memory, unwilling to speak in detail about what had happened to her. This reticence, while understandable, left room for others to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. In Dawn, the tournament was remembered with particular bitterness. The public humiliation of Elia Martell, the Dornish princess who had done everything that was asked of her, who had given Rhaegar 2 children and represented Dorne's connection to the Iron Throne, was not something the Dornish could forgive. The fact that Elia's humiliation at Harrenhal was followed by her brutal murder during the war created a narrative of betrayal and injustice that poisoned Dornish relations with the new regime for years. The Dornish telling of the story emphasised Elia's grace under pressure, her dignity in the face of her husband's public slight. They portrayed Rhaegar as cruel, or at best thoughtlessly selfish. Someone who had dishonoured the woman who loved him in pursuit of a northern girl who may not have even wanted his attention. And they reserved particular fury for those who had murdered Elia and her children, viewing those deaths as consequences that flowed in part from the dishonour Rhaegar had shown her at Harrenhal, in the Stormlands and particularly around Storm's End. The tournament was remembered as the place where Robert Baratheon's betrothed was insulted and effectively stolen from him. Robert himself spoke often of Harrenhal in his years as king, usually when drunk, telling anyone who would listen about how he had watched Rhaegar crown Lyanna, how he had known even then that something terrible was going to happen, how his instinct had been to challenge Rhaegar immediately, but he had been restrained by those around him. Robert's version of events, repeated often and with the authority of a king behind it, became the dominant narrative in many parts of the realm. Rhaegar was the villain who had abducted a maiden and needed to be killed. Lyanna was the innocent victim who had died because of what was done to her. The war was justified because it was fought against a mad king and his villainous son. This interpretation simplified a complex reality, but it was the version that the new regime promoted because it justified their rule and their actions. Among those who had actually been present at Harrenhal, who had witnessed the events firsthand, there was a more nuanced understanding. They had seen the shocked silence when Rhaegar crowned Lyanna, had felt the tension in the air, had observed the reactions of all those involved. They knew that the reality was more complicated than the song suggested, that people's motivations were mixed, that it was not a simple story of heroes and villains, but something more human and more ambiguous. But as the years passed, as those who had been present at Harrenhal died or their memories faded, the first-hand accounts became scarcer, and the interpretations based on those accounts became more dominant. The living memory of the event was replaced by cultural memory, by stories that had been shaped and reshaped through countless tellings, by narratives that served particular purposes or expressed particular viewpoints. The tournament at Harrenhal became less a thing that had actually happened, and more a story that was told. A set of symbols and meanings that people could use to think about power and love and duty and consequence. One of the great unanswered questions that historians have debated concerns what Rhaegar actually intended when he crowned Lyanna. Was it a declaration of love, an impulsive gesture driven by feelings he could not control? Was it a political statement of some kind, perhaps meant to signal an alliance between the Crown and the North? Was it related to Rhaegar's obsession with prophecy, to some belief that Lyanna had a role to play in the destiny he thought he was fulfilling? Or was it simply a way of honouring someone whose courage he had discovered, an acknowledgement of the Knight of the Laughing Tree if he had indeed determined that Lyanna was that mysterious knight? The Maesters have examined what is known of Rhaegar's character and beliefs to try to answer this question. Rhaegar was deeply interested in prophecy, particularly in predictions about a prince that was promised who would save the world from some great darkness. He had been raised as a bookish boy, becoming a warrior later when he decided that prophecy required it of him. He was melancholy and serious, seemed to carry the weight of destiny on his shoulders, spoke sometimes in ways that suggested he knew or believed he knew things that others did not. Some historians have suggested that Rhaegar believed Lyanna was necessary for the fulfillment of prophecy, that he needed her for some reason connected to his understanding of what was to come. This would explain why he acted as he did, why he was willing to dishonour his wife and risk political chaos. Because he believed the stakes were higher than personal honour or political stability. But this theory requires accepting that Rhaegar's belief in prophecy was so strong that it overrode his judgment, that he was willing to gamble the realm's peace on mystical predictions that might not be accurate. Others have argued for a simpler explanation, that Rhaegar fell in love with Lyanna or believed he did, that his actions were driven by human emotion rather than prophetic insight. He saw in her something that moved him, perhaps her courage, perhaps her spirit, perhaps simply her beauty. And being human and fallible despite his royal status, he acted on those feelings in a way that was inappropriate and ultimately catastrophic. This explanation has the virtue of not requiring us to understand prophecy or mysticism, only to recognize that even princes can make terrible choices when their feelings override their judgment. The truth likely lies somewhere in the complex intersection of prophecy, politics, and personal feeling. Rhaegar may have been influenced by all of these factors simultaneously, may have convinced himself that what he wanted personally aligned with what prophecy required, may have failed to distinguish between his desires and his destiny. Human motivation is rarely simple or pure. And Rhaegar's motivations at Harrenhal were probably as mixed and complicated as those of any person facing a significant choice. The question of whether Lyanna went with Rhaegar willingly, or was taken by force, remains perhaps the most contentious of all the unresolved questions about the tournament and its aftermath. Those who knew Lyanna had different opinions based on their understanding of her character. Robert was absolutely convinced that she would never have gone willingly, that she was loyal to him and to her family, that she was a victim of Rhaegar's villainy. Eddard Stark, who knew his sister better than Robert did, was more ambiguous in what he said about the matter, neither confirming nor denying either interpretation, maintaining a silence that suggested he knew more than he was willing to say. The evidence is genuinely unclear. Lyanna was known to be spirited and independent, someone who might have been attracted to Rhaegar's melancholy romanticism in ways she was not attracted to Robert's aggressive passion. She had expressed reservations about Robert's faithfulness, had worried that he would not be constant to her, and she had been honoured by Rhaegar at Harrenhal in a way that must have affected her, must have created some kind of connection between them, even if only in the form of shared experience and shared scrutiny. But Lyanna was also 16 years old, betrothed to another man, part of a family and culture that valued duty and honour. Even if she was attracted to Rhaegar, even if she returned his feelings, choosing to abandon her betrothal and run away with a married man would have required her to violate every expectation and obligation that defined her life. It would have required her to hurt people she loved, including her father and brothers, to bring shame on her house, to cause a scandal that could have political ramifications. Whether she would have made that choice, whether she would have been willing to pay that price for love or for whatever Rhaegar offered her, is something we cannot know with certainty. The maesters must conclude, after examining all the available evidence, that both versions of events are possible, that we lack the information necessary to determine definitively what happened. This uncertainty is frustrating for those who want clear answers, who want to know whether to view Rhaegar and Lyanna as tragic lovers or as perpetrators and victim of a crime. But history often denies us the clarity we seek, leaves us with questions that cannot be fully answered, requires us to live with ambiguity even when we would prefer certainty. What is known with certainty is that Lyanna died at the Tower of Joy, that Eddard Stark was with her at the end, that she made him promise something that he kept secret for the rest of his life. The nature of that promise has been the subject of endless speculation. The most obvious interpretation is that she asked to be buried at Winterfell, to be brought home to the north, and this was indeed done. Her bones rest in the crypts beneath Winterfell. Her statue stands among those of other Starks, and she is home as she wished. But some have suggested that the promise involved something more, something that would explain the presence of 3 Kingsguard knights at the tower, something that would account for the secrecy with which Ned guarded whatever he knew about Lyanna's final days. The theory that Lyanna gave birth to Rhaegar's child at the Tower of Joy, that the promise involved protecting that child, has been advanced by those trying to make sense of the mysteries surrounding her death. But this theory raises as many questions as it answers, and without confirmation from Ned or Howland Reed, it remains speculation. What the tournament at Harrenhal ultimately represents, in the various historical and cultural interpretations that have been offered, is a moment of transformation disguised as a celebration. Those who attended thought they were going to a tournament, to a gathering where they would watch knights compete and lords negotiate, and everyone would enjoy a spectacle. What they witnessed instead was the beginning of the end for House Targaryen, the planting of seeds that would grow into civil war, the point where the realm's history pivoted in a new direction. The false spring that blessed the tournament with its unseasonable warmth became a perfect metaphor for the event itself. Beautiful and warm, but temporary and ultimately false, promising something it could not deliver, creating conditions that could not be sustained. When the false spring ended and the cold returned, it returned with a vengeance, and the winter that followed the tournament was long and harsh both literally and metaphorically. The realm entered a winter of war and suffering that would last for years, and would fundamentally change the political landscape of Westeros. The blue winter roses that Rhaegar used for Lyanna's crown became the most enduring symbol of the tournament. Appearing in songs and stories, on tapestries and in paintings, representing different things to different people. To some, they symbolise tragic love and the terrible consequences of passion. To others, they represented dishonour and betrayal, the moment when a prince forgot his duties. To still others, they were a reminder of how small gestures can have vast and unintended consequences, how a choice made in a moment can echo through the years and change the world. The tournament at Harrenhal, understood through these multiple lenses of maester history and minstrel song, of common wisdom and regional interpretation, of what is known and what can only be guessed at, emerges as an event whose significance far exceeded what anyone present understood at the time. It was a gathering that seemed to be about chivalry and competition, about celebration and political manoeuvring of the ordinary sort. But it was actually the moment when the realm's fate turned, when the tensions that had been building found their catalyst, when individual choices combined with larger forces to produce transformation. The historians and singers and common folk who remember Harrenhal are all trying in their different ways to understand the same fundamental mystery. How did the world change so quickly and so dramatically? How did a tournament lead to a war? How did a crown of flowers contribute to the fall of a dynasty? The answers they offer differ based on their perspectives and their purposes, but all of them recognise that something important happened at Harrenhal, something that needs to be remembered and understood even if it can never be fully explained. And so the tournament lives on in memory and in story, a moment frozen in time. Forever the gathering in the full spring when everything changed. We've journeyed together through one of Westeros' most pivotal moments, not through the clash of steel or the roar of dragons, but through the quieter paths of human choice and consequence. We've walked among those who gathered in that full spring, who jousted and feasted and made decisions whose implications they could not see, who lived and loved and died without knowing how history would remember them. There was beauty at Harrenhal, genuine beauty in the pageantry and the fellowship, in the crown of blue winter roses and the melancholy prince who offered them. And there was sorrow too, the kind that comes from understanding how fragile peace can be, how quickly warmth can give way to cold. Tonight you've witnessed a world at its turning point, have felt the weight of choices made in moments that seemed ordinary, but which contained entire futures. The tournament stands now in memory, that gathering of thousands in a place cursed and haunted, where the living celebrated while the ghosts of Harrenhal watched from the shadows. It reminds us that we never truly know which moments will matter, which gestures will echo through the years, which paths we choose will lead to transformation. Let your mind drift now across the fields of Harrenhal. Imagine the pavilions dissolving into mist, the crowds fading like memories do, leaving only the ancient stones and the god's eye reflecting stars. The false spring has ended, but sleep brings its own warmth, its own peace. And now your watch has ended. Rest well and let the realm fade into dreams.